The morning of Harry Potter's 11th birthday arrived with all the enthusiasm of a funeral march. Number 4. Privet Drive maintained its pristine suburban facade, every blade of grass trimmed to regulation height, every hedge sculpted with the precision of military discipline. Inside, however, the Dursley household crackled with intention so thick it could have been bottled and sold as anxiety potion. Harry had learned long ago not to expect birthday celebrations. The Dursleys treated his existence like a necessary evil, something to be managed rather than celebrated. But this particular birthday felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He'd been having strange dreams for weeks now, dreams filled with green light and the sound of his mother's voice calling his name. From his cupboard under the stairs, Harry could hear Uncle Vernon pacing in the kitchen, his heavy footsteps creating a rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the floorboards. Aunt Petunia's voice carried clearly through the thin walls, sharp and anxious, in a way that immediately set Harry on edge. Something was coming. He could feel it in the way the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The first owl arrived precisely at sunrise. Harry was awake, as he always was during these early hours when the house remained blissfully quiet, and he could think without interruption. The soft tapping at the kitchen window cut through the morning silence like a blade. Then came Uncle Vernon's bellow of rage, a sound so primal and furious that Harry pressed himself against the cupboard door, heart hammering. Uncle Vernon's voice boomed through the house with volcanic intensity. "No," he roared. "Absolutely not. Not in his house. Not after 11 years of keeping that world away from his family." The tapping persisted, patient and methodical. Harry crept from his cupboard and peered around the corner into the kitchen. A magnificent tawny owl perched on the windowsill, completely unfazed by Uncle Vernon's purple-faced fury. In its beak, it clutched a thick envelope made of yellowish parchment that seemed to glow in the morning light. Uncle Vernon approached the window with the caution of a man approaching a loaded weapon. His meaty hands trembled as he opened the window, and the owl dropped the letter onto the kitchen table with ceremonial precision before launching itself back into the dawn sky. For a long moment, nobody moved. The envelope sat there like an unexploded bomb, and Harry found himself drawn toward it despite every instinct screaming danger. Written across the front in emerald green ink was an address that made his blood run cold with recognition he couldn't quite place. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. The specificity of that address hit Harry like a physical blow. They knew, whoever had sent this letter, knew exactly where he slept, knew about the cupboard that had been his prison for as long as he could remember. This wasn't some random piece of mail delivered to the wrong address. This was intentional, targeted, and somehow that precision felt more threatening than comforting. Uncle Vernon snatched up the letter with hands that shook so violently he could barely maintain his grip. His eyes scanned the address, and his face cycled through emotions Harry had never seen before. Fear, yes, but also something that looked almost like guilt. Aunt Petunia appeared in the doorway, her gaunt face pale as parchment. When she saw the letter in Vernon's hands, she made a sound like a wounded animal. Her voice came out in a whisper that carried more terror than any scream. "It's starting," she breathed, just like they said it would. Exactly 11 years to the day. Harry felt his world tilt sideways. They had been expecting this. The Dursleys, who claimed to know nothing about the magical world that had supposedly killed his parents, had been waiting for this moment for 11 years. Every harsh word, every punishment, every reminder that he was unwanted, suddenly took on a different quality. They hadn't just been cruel. They had been preparing. Uncle Vernon's voice, when he finally found it, carried an edge of panic that Harry had never heard before. "We agreed," he said, addressing the letter as if it might respond. "We did everything they asked. We kept him small, kept him ignorant, kept him grateful for scraps. We held up our end of the bargain." The words hit Harry like ice water. Bargain. They had made some kind of agreement about him, about his life, about his future. The Dursleys hadn't taken him in out of family obligation or even grudging duty. They had been paid, instructed, given specific guidelines for raising him, and those guidelines apparently involved keeping him small and grateful. Aunt Petunia moved to Vernon's side, her bony fingers plucking at the letter's edges. Her voice carried a desperate quality that made Harry's stomach turn. "Maybe if we destroy it," she suggested. "Maybe if we pretend it never came." But even as she spoke, another tapping sound echoed from the front window, then another from the living room. The sound multiplied, creating a percussion that seemed to come from every window in the house. Harry pressed himself against the wall and peered toward the front door. Through the frosted glass, he could see shadows moving. Dozens of them. Uncle Vernon moved through the house like a man possessed, checking each window in turn. At every one, owls waited with identical letters. The birds regarded him with an intelligence that seemed almost human, patient and implacable. They would wait as long as necessary. The sight of so many owls surrounding the house should have been magical, beautiful even. Instead, it felt like a siege. These weren't gentle messengers bringing birthday wishes. They were enforcement officers, ensuring that their message could not be ignored or destroyed. Harry's mind raced as pieces of his life suddenly clicked into horrifying clarity. The strange accidents that happened around him when he was angry or scared. The way his hair grew back overnight after particularly awful haircuts. The time he had somehow ended up on the school roof without remembering how he got there. Magic. It had been magic all along, and the Dursleys had known. More than known. They had been actively working to suppress it. Uncle Vernon returned to the kitchen, his face now a mottled purple that suggested either rage or the onset of a heart attack. The letter trembled in his grip as he stared at it, like it might spontaneously combust. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. 11 years, he muttered. 11 years we've done exactly what that manipulative old man told us to do. Kept the boy weak, kept him isolated, made sure he'd be properly grateful when they came for him. And this is how they repay us. Harry felt his knees go weak. The careful construction of his entire childhood suddenly made terrible sense. The cupboard wasn't just cruelty. It was designed to make him small, both physically and emotionally. The constant reminders that he was unwanted, that he should be grateful for even basic necessities, weren't just the Dursleys' natural nastiness. They were following instructions. Someone had wanted him broken down, made malleable, prepared to accept whatever they offered as salvation. Someone had orchestrated his misery with surgical precision, and the Dursleys had been willing participants in exchange for what? Money? Protection? The promise of being left alone? Aunt Petunia's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. What do we do, Vernon? If we don't let him go, they'll keep sending letters. You know they will. They'll escalate, just like they did with my sister. Her sister. Harry's mother. Petunia had been through this before, had watched as the magical world came for Lily Evans and transformed her into someone else, entirely. The pattern was repeating, and Petunia clearly remembered how it ended. Uncle Vernon set the letter down on the kitchen table with exaggerated care, as if it might explode at any sudden movement. His voice carried a defeated quality that somehow frightened Harry more than his usual bluster. "We read it," he declared. "We read it. We follow the instructions exactly. And we hope they keep their word about leaving us alone afterward." The letter's wax seal bore a coat of arms that seemed to shift and move in Harry's peripheral vision. 4 animals surrounding a large letter H, rendered in colours that seemed too vivid for normal ink. Uncle Vernon broke the seal with the reverence usually reserved for disarming bombs. The letter unfolded to reveal several pages of text, written in the same emerald ink as the address. Uncle Vernon's lips moved silently as he read, his expression growing darker with each line. Finally, he thrust the letter toward Aunt Petunia with disgust. "Read it yourself," he snarled. "Read about their wonderful school and their generous offer to take our burden off our hands. See if you can spot the hooks hidden in every line." Aunt Petunia accepted the letter with trembling fingers, her pale eyes scanning the text quickly. As she read, her expression shifted from fear to something approaching hatred. When she finished, she looked up at Vernon with eyes bright with unshed tears. "They're not giving us a choice," she whispered. "Look at the language they use. Your acceptance letter, it says, not an invitation, not an offer. An acceptance of something we apparently already agreed to." Harry found his voice for the first time since the morning's chaos began. His words came out small and uncertain, but carrying an edge of defiance that surprised even him. "What if I don't want to go?" The silence that followed his question stretched so long and became so complete that Harry wondered if he had actually spoken aloud. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia exchanged a look that contained layers of communication he couldn't pass. Finally, Uncle Vernon's voice emerged as a harsh whisper. "That's not how this works, boy. You don't get to choose. None of us do. This was all decided a long time ago by people who don't ask permission and don't take no for an answer." But something in Uncle Vernon's tone suggested that maybe, just maybe, choice was exactly what those people didn't want Harry to realize he had. The letter sat there between them, simultaneously an invitation and a threat, offering a future that had apparently been predetermined before Harry even knew magic existed. The tapping at the windows continued, a constant reminder that the magical world was waiting for his response. But as Harry stared at the letter that would determine the course of his life, a different kind of magic began stirring within him. Not the accidental bursts of power that had marked his childhood, but something more deliberate and infinitely more dangerous. The magic of conscious choice. Harry reached across the table and picked up the letter, ignoring Uncle Vernon's sharp intake of breath. The parchment felt warm beneath his fingers, almost alive with possibility. But as he read the formal language inviting him to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, all he could think about were Uncle Vernon's words about keeping him small and grateful. Someone had engineered his misery to make him jump at the first alternative offered. Someone had counted on him being so desperate for escape that he wouldn't question the nature of his rescue. Someone had made the calculation that 11 years of systematic emotional abuse would produce a perfectly compliant tool, that someone had made a mistake. Harry Potter had learned to survive by being observant, by noticing the small details that others missed, and what he noticed now was that this letter, for all its formal language and impressive presentation, felt less like an rescue and more like a collection notice. He was expected to be grateful, expected to comply, expected to follow instructions without question, just like he had his entire life. The thought crystallized into something approaching rage. Not the hot, uncontrolled fury that had marked his childhood accidents, but something cold and calculating and utterly resolute. He looked up from the letter to find both Dursleys watching him with expressions of poorly concealed terror. "What if I refuse?" he asked quietly. Uncle Vernon's voice cracked as he responded. "You can't refuse, boy. People like us don't refuse people like them. We do what we're told, and we hope they remember their promises when it's over." But Harry was no longer listening to Uncle Vernon. He was staring at the letter in his hands and thinking about patterns, about the precision with which his misery had been orchestrated, about the casual assumption that he would be grateful for any alternative to his current situation, about the possibility that his rescue might just be another kind of cage. The owls continued their patient tapping at the windows, but Harry no longer heard them as enforcement officers. They were just birds, following instructions, delivering a message from people who had never bothered to ask what he actually wanted. For the first time in his 11 years of life, Harry Potter began to consider the radical possibility that what he wanted might actually matter. The letter crumpled slightly in his tightening grip as he made a decision that would change everything. Not the decision they expected, not the grateful compliance they had so carefully engineered. something else entirely. Outside, the owls continued their vigil, but inside number 4 Privet Drive, the carefully constructed plans of Albus Dumbledore began their first small crack toward complete collapse. Harry looked up from the letter with eyes that held a new kind of fire. "Uncle Vernon," he said quietly, his voice carrying a strength that made both adults step backward. "I think we need to have a very long conversation about exactly what kind of bargain you made about my life." The letter fell to the table between them, and for the first time since his parents died, Harry Potter began to take control of his own story. The emergency session of the International Confederation of Wizards convened in Geneva 3 weeks after the investigation into Harry Potter's case concluded, bringing together magical representatives from 47 nations to address what had become the most significant child welfare scandal in modern magical history. The ornate assembly hall, with its soaring Gothic arches and enchanted ceiling that reflected the aurora borealis regardless of season, had witnessed many historic debates about magical law and international cooperation, but never before had the assembled delegates gathered to address systematic child abuse orchestrated by one of the most respected figures in magical education. Harry observed the proceedings from the witness gallery, flanked by Madame Maxime and senior investigator Delacour, whose presence served as both protection and reminder that his testimony had triggered international legal action that would reshape magical child welfare law for generations to come. The weight of that responsibility sat heavily on his 11-year-old shoulders, but it was balanced by something he had never experienced before in his short life: the knowledge that his voice had been heard, believed, and acted upon by adults whose primary concern was justice rather than institutional preservation. The opening statements delivered by delegate after delegate revealed the scope of international outrage that Harry's case had generated within the global magical community. Representative after representative rose to express their government's shock and dismay at evidence that systematic child abuse had been orchestrated and maintained for over a decade by someone whose international reputation had been built on principles of child protection and educational excellence. The delegate from Switzerland, a stern woman whose steel-grey hair and precise movements suggested extensive experience with international magical law, delivered what would become one of the most quoted statements from the proceedings. The evidence presented regarding Professor Dumbledore's systematic violation of this child's welfare represents not merely individual criminal conduct, but institutional failure that calls into question the fundamental assumptions underlying our approach to magical education and child protection, she declared, her voice carrying the moral authority that had made her one of Europe's most respected advocates for magical children's rights. She gestured toward the comprehensive documentation that had been distributed to all participating nations prior to the emergency session. When institutions dedicated to child welfare become instruments of child abuse, when educators become manipulators, when protection becomes control disguised as care, we must examine not only individual violations, but the systemic failures that made such violations possible and sustainable. The moral clarity of her statement resonated throughout the assembly hall, but it was the delegate from Germany who articulated the specific legal and political implications that Harry's case created for international magical cooperation. The violation of this child's parents' explicit wishes regarding his guardianship and education represents a fundamental assault on the principle of family sovereignty that underlies all international magical law, he observed, with the precision that had made German magical jurisprudence influential throughout Europe. If magical authorities can simply disregard parental instructions and legal documents in pursuit of strategic objectives, then no magical family can trust that their children will be safe from institutional manipulation disguised as protection. The point was legally and politically significant because it established that Harry's case was not an isolated incident, but evidence of systematic institutional overreach that threatened the basic legal frameworks governing magical families and educational choice throughout the international community. But it was the testimony of Professor Minerva McGonagall, delivered via magical communication from Britain, where she remained under investigation for her role in Dumbledore's systematic violations that provided the most damaging evidence about the scope and duration of institutional corruption within British magical education. McGonagall's voice, transmitted through the Assembly Hall's enchanted communication system, carried a weight of personal anguish that made her revelations about Dumbledore's methods more powerful than any legal documentation could achieve. For 37 years I served as Deputy Headmistress at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry under Professor Dumbledore's leadership, she began, her Scottish accent more pronounced than usual in the way that suggested emotional stress. Throughout that time, I believed that his unconventional methods and secretive decision-making were motivated by wisdom and experience that I was not qualified to question. Her pause was audible through the magical transmission, and Harry could sense the struggle she was experiencing as she grappled with decades of misplaced trust and institutional loyalty. The investigation into Mr. Potter's case has forced me to re-examine countless decisions and policies that I supported or implemented without question because I trusted Professor Dumbledore's judgment more than my own moral instincts, McGonagall continued, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to confront her own complicity in systematic violations of student welfare. She detailed specific instances where Dumbledore had manipulated student placement, controlled information access, and used psychological pressure to maintain compliance with educational policies that served his strategic objectives rather than student development. Each revelation added to the growing evidence that Harry's case was not an aberration, but part of a systematic approach to magical education that treated students as assets to be managed rather than individuals to be respected and developed. Most significantly, McGonagall's testimony revealed that other Hogwarts faculty members had raised concerns about Dumbledore's methods over the years, only to be silenced through a combination of professional pressure and implied threats to their careers and reputations. The pattern of institutional intimidation and suppression of dissent that McGonagall described resonated throughout the International Assembly, creating a picture of educational corruption that extended far beyond individual policy mistakes or well-intentioned overreach. When McGonagall's testimony concluded, the Assembly Hall remained silent for several minutes as delegates absorbed the implications of systematic educational corruption within one of the magical world's most prestigious and influential institutions. It was the delegate from France who broke the silence with a formal motion that would reshape international magical law and establish new standards for educational accountability and student protection. "Madame President," she said, rising with the formal dignity that characterized French magical diplomacy, "I move that this Assembly vote to censure the British Ministry of Magic for its failure to provide adequate oversight of magical educational institutions and to establish international standards for magical child welfare that supersede national institutional policies when those policies violate fundamental principles of individual rights and family sovereignty." The motion was seconded immediately by delegates from 12 different nations, indicating widespread international support for formal action against Britain's handling of magical education and child protection. But it was the delegate from Bulgaria who proposed the most far-reaching response to the systematic violations that Harry's case had revealed. "Madame President," he said, with the careful precision that suggested extensive consultation with his government prior to the session, "I move that this Assembly establish an international magical child welfare authority with jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute violations of magical children's rights regardless of national boundaries or institutional prestige." The proposal was revolutionary in scope, creating international legal authority that would supersede national sovereignty when magical children's welfare was at stake. It represented exactly the kind of structural reform that Harry had hoped his testimony might trigger, establishing permanent protections that would prevent other children from experiencing the systematic manipulation and abuse he had endured. The voting on both motions was swift and decisive, with only Britain and 2 of its closest magical allies opposing measures that commanded overwhelming international support. The final tally of 39 votes in favor, 3 opposed, and 5 abstentions represented one of the most lopsided decisions in the Confederation's history, but the political ramifications extended far beyond formal censure and new legal frameworks. As word of the Confederation's actions spread throughout the international magical community, other magical schools began announcing policy changes designed to prevent the kind of systematic student manipulation that had characterized British magical education under Dumbledore's influence. The Durmstrang Institute announced that it would no longer accept students whose placement violated their families' explicit wishes, regardless of pressure from governmental authorities. The Salem Witches Institute established formal procedures for investigating student complaints about faculty manipulation or institutional coercion. Magical schools throughout South America, Asia, and Africa implemented new protections for student agency and educational choice that reflected international consensus about the fundamental rights of magical children. Most significantly, Beauxbatons Academy announced the establishment of the Potter Initiative, an international program designed to assist magical students who sought to escape educational environments that violated their rights or failed to serve their developmental needs. The program, funded through a combination of international donations and legal settlements from the British Ministry, would provide sanctuary, legal protection, and educational alternatives for magical children whose families or governments attempted to force them into educational arrangements that served institutional interests rather than individual development. Harry watched the announcement of the Potter Initiative from Madame Maxime's office, surrounded by the international students who had become his chosen family during his transformative months at Beauxbatons Academy. The knowledge that his personal struggle for educational choice had created permanent structures to protect other magical children provided a sense of purpose and accomplishment that transcended any individual legal victory. But it was a letter that arrived during the Confederation's closing ceremonies that provided the most personally meaningful acknowledgement of the changes Harry's courage had triggered throughout the international magical community. The letter bore the seal of the International Magical Child Welfare Authority that had been established through the emergency session, but it was signed by dozens of magical children from around the world who had been inspired by Harry's example to challenge institutional manipulation and demand respect for their own rights and preferences. Dear Harry, the collective letter began. We wanted you to know that your decision to stand up for your right to choose your own educational path has given us the courage to question adults who claim to know what's best for us while refusing to explain their reasoning or consider our feelings and preferences. The letter continued with specific examples of magical children who had used the new international protections to escape educational arrangements that served institutional purposes rather than individual development. A girl from Romania whose family had tried to force her into a program designed to suppress her natural magical abilities because they conflicted with traditional gender expectations. A boy from Japan whose magical government had attempted to place him in a specialized institution that would have isolated him from normal social development in pursuit of enhanced magical power. Each example demonstrated that Harry's case had established precedent and created legal frameworks that protected magical children's fundamental rights to agency, choice, and respectful treatment by adults who claimed authority over their lives and futures. Most importantly, the letter revealed that magical children throughout the international community now understood that adult authority was not automatically legitimate, that institutional reputation did not guarantee ethical behavior, and that their own preferences and feelings deserved serious consideration rather than dismissal as symptoms of immaturity or foreign manipulation. Reading the letter surrounded by his international friends at Beauxbatons, Harry felt something settle into place in his understanding of his own identity and purpose that had nothing to do with fame or symbolic importance, and everything to do with the knowledge that his struggle for individual dignity had created lasting change that would benefit magical children for generations to come. The transformation was complete. The scared, manipulated child who had lived in the cupboard under the stairs had become someone whose moral courage and legal persistence had reshaped international magical law and established permanent protections for children whose rights had been systematically violated by adults who claimed to act in their best interests. But beyond the legal victories and international recognition, what mattered most to Harry was the simple knowledge that he had found his place in the magical world, not through acceptance of predetermined destiny, but through conscious choice based on his own values and interests. As the sun set behind the Pyrenees peaks, painting Beauxbatons Academy in shades of gold and rose, Harry Potter looked toward a future that he would determine for himself according to principles he had chosen, rather than obligations imposed by others who claimed to understand his purpose better than he understood it himself. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by people who valued his thoughts and feelings, engaged in work that reflected his genuine interests and abilities, and protected by legal frameworks that recognized his fundamental right to control his own destiny, regardless of whatever strategic importance others might assign to his existence. The revolution that had begun with his rejection of a single letter had become a transformation that extended far beyond his individual circumstances to encompass fundamental changes in how magical society understood childhood, education, and the rights of individuals to resist institutional manipulation disguised as protection and guidance. And at the center of that transformation stood Harry Potter. No longer a symbol to be managed or a tool to be wielded, but a young man whose moral clarity and personal courage had demonstrated that individual dignity was worth defending regardless of the power and prestige of those who threatened it. 1 year after his escape from Privet Drive, Harry Potter stood before the Advanced Transfiguration class at Beauxbatons Academy with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered not just his magical abilities, but his capacity to shape the world around him through conscious choice and moral courage. The transformation was visible in everything from his posture, which no longer carried the unconscious hunching of someone expecting punishment, to his eyes, which held the steady warmth of someone who understood his own worth and refused to accept treatment that diminished it. The classroom itself reflected the educational philosophy that had allowed Harry to flourish in ways that would never have been possible under the British magical system. Instead of rigid rows of desks facing a single authority figure, the space was arranged in flexible configurations that encouraged collaboration and discussion. Students worked individually or in small groups according to their learning preferences and the requirements of specific projects, while Professor Beaumont moved among them, offering guidance and support rather than commanding attention and compliance. Harry's current project involved developing an original transfiguration technique that combined elements from different magical traditions, a synthesis approach that would have been considered inappropriate or even dangerous in the standardized curriculum that characterized British magical education. But at Beauxbatons, intellectual curiosity and creative problem-solving were valued more highly than adherence to predetermined methods and traditional boundaries. The technique Harry was developing drew inspiration from Celtic ward-weaving, Norse protective magic, and Egyptian transformation principles, creating something entirely new that reflected his growing understanding of magic as a collaborative art rather than a competitive demonstration of individual power. More importantly, the project allowed him to explore questions about magical theory and practical application that interested him personally, rather than fulfilling requirements imposed by others who claimed to know what he needed to learn. Working beside him, Fleur Delacour reviewed her own advanced project with the focused intensity that had made her one of the most respected students in their year, despite being only 13 years old. Her research into cross-cultural healing techniques had already attracted attention from international magical medical organizations, but she approached her academic success with the kind of grounded humility that Harry had learned was characteristic of students who understood education as personal development rather than competitive achievement. The friendship that had developed between them over the past year represented everything that Harry's previous social isolation had prevented him from experiencing. Not the desperate gratitude of someone thankful for any positive attention, but the mutual respect and shared interests that formed the foundation for genuine connection between equals who chose each other's company freely, rather than accepting assignment by institutional convenience. Their conversation flowed seamlessly between French and English, a linguistic flexibility that reflected the international perspective that Beauxbatons cultivated in all its students. Harry's fluency in French had developed rapidly once he was freed from the assumption that learning was something imposed on him, rather than something he could pursue according to his own interests and pace. Do you think the British ministry realizes how much their reputation has been damaged by the international response to your case? Fleur asked, her question reflecting the kind of political awareness that Beauxbatons encouraged its students to develop, rather than protecting them from adult complexities through information control and simplified explanations. Harry considered the question seriously, drawing on his growing understanding of international magical politics and the institutional dynamics that had shaped his early experience with magical authority. "I think they understand that their credibility has been damaged," he replied thoughtfully. "But I doubt they fully comprehend how fundamentally their approach to magical education and child welfare has been rejected by the international community. They seem to believe this is a temporary political problem rather than evidence that their entire system needs structural reform." The analysis reflected Harry's development from someone who accepted adult explanations without question to someone capable of independent political and institutional analysis based on direct observation and systematic study. But more importantly, Harry had learned that his individual case was part of larger patterns of institutional manipulation and control that extended far beyond British magical education. The letters that arrived daily from magical children throughout the international community revealed systematic problems with authoritarian approaches to childhood and education that characterized magical societies worldwide. The Potter Initiative that had been established in his name had already assisted over 300 magical children in escaping educational environments that violated their rights or failed to serve their developmental needs. Each successful case created precedent and strengthened legal protections that made it increasingly difficult for magical authorities to treat children as assets to be managed rather than individuals to be respected and supported. Professor Beaumont approached their workstation with the kind of respectful interest that had characterized all of Harry's interactions with Beauxbatons faculty. Rather than demanding immediate attention or interrupting student focus, she waited for a natural pause in their concentration before offering guidance that built on their existing understanding, rather than replacing it with predetermined conclusions. "Mr. Potter," she said warmly, "I have been observing your synthesis approach with considerable interest. The integration of protective elements from multiple traditions suggests innovative thinking that could contribute significantly to defensive magic theory. Have you considered presenting your preliminary findings at the International Student Research Symposium next spring? The suggestion represented an opportunity that would have been inconceivable under the British system, where student research was typically confined to reproducing established techniques rather than developing original approaches to magical problems. But at Beauxbatons, student intellectual contributions were valued and encouraged regardless of age or academic status. Harry felt a familiar flutter of excitement at the prospect of sharing his work with the broader magical academic community, not because he craved recognition or approval, but because he genuinely believed his research might contribute to magical knowledge in ways that could benefit others. "Professor Beaumont," he replied with the respectful enthusiasm that had replaced his previous anxious deference to adult authority, "I would be honored to participate in the symposium. The integration techniques I have been developing might indeed offer new approaches to protective magic that could be useful for international magical security applications." The confidence in his own intellectual contributions reflected the transformation that had occurred once Harry was freed from educational environments designed to maintain dependence and compliance rather than foster independent thinking and creative problem-solving. But it was the arrival of Luna Lovegood at Beauxbatons that provided the most tangible evidence of how Harry's example had inspired other magical children to pursue educational alternatives that better served their individual needs and interests. Luna had transferred from Hogwarts after her second year, following a systematic campaign of institutional bullying that had been permitted and even encouraged as a means of maintaining social conformity and discouraging intellectual independence. Her application to Beauxbatons had been supported by documentation provided through the Potter Initiative, which had developed sophisticated methods for assisting magical children who sought escape from educational environments that violated their rights or suppressed their natural development. The transformation in Luna's demeanor and academic performance was immediately apparent to anyone who had known her during her time in the British magical system, where she had previously been isolated and marginalized for her intellectual curiosity and unconventional thinking. At Beauxbatons she was valued precisely for the unique perspectives and creative problem-solving approaches that had made her a target for institutional suppression. Her research into magical creature communication had attracted international attention within months of her arrival, and her collaboration with students from different cultural backgrounds had produced innovative approaches to interspecies magical cooperation that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between human and non-human magical beings. Most importantly, Luna had found her place in a community that celebrated intellectual diversity and encouraged students to pursue their genuine interests rather than conforming to predetermined expectations about appropriate areas of study and acceptable methods of magical development. Harry watched Luna work with the same protective pride he might have felt for a younger sibling, understanding that her successful transition to Beauxbatons represented validation of his own decision to pursue educational alternatives despite institutional pressure and emotional manipulation. But it was the letter that arrived from Neville Longbottom that provided the most comprehensive perspective on how Harry's example had triggered changes throughout the international magical community that extended far beyond individual educational choices. Neville's letter, written from the International Magical Botanical Research Station in Switzerland, where he had been accepted as the youngest research assistant in the institution's history, described systematic reforms in magical education that had been implemented in response to international pressure generated by Harry's case. The British Ministry has been forced to establish new oversight procedures for magical child placement and educational assignment, Neville wrote in handwriting that reflected the confidence he had developed once freed from educational environments designed to suppress rather than support his natural talents and interests. More importantly, Hogwarts has implemented new policies requiring faculty to respect student preferences and family wishes regarding educational approaches and career development. They can no longer simply assign students to predetermined paths based on institutional convenience or strategic objectives. The reforms represented fundamental changes in how British magical institutions approached childhood and education, acknowledging individual rights and family sovereignty that had been systematically violated for generations under Dumbledore's authoritarian leadership. But Neville's letter also revealed that resistance to change remained strong among faculty and administrators who had built their careers on the assumption that institutional wisdom superseded individual choice and that student compliance was more important than student development. Professor Snape resigned rather than accept new requirements for respectful treatment of students whose backgrounds or abilities differed from his personal preferences, Neville continued. Several other faculty members have been placed under formal review for educational practices that violate the new international standards for magical child welfare. The personnel changes reflected the depth of institutional transformation required to align British magical education with international standards for child welfare and educational ethics that Harry's case had helped establish. But the most significant development was the establishment of formal exchange programs between Hogwarts and international magical schools, creating opportunities for British students to experience educational alternatives that prioritized individual development and cultural diversity over institutional conformity and national isolation. Professor McGonagall has been appointed as acting headmistress, while a comprehensive review of Hogwarts policies and procedures is conducted by international educational experts, Neville's letter concluded. She specifically requested that I convey her gratitude for your courage in challenging systematic violations that she now recognizes she should have opposed years ago instead of enabling through institutional loyalty and misplaced trust. Reading McGonagall's message while surrounded by the supportive community he had found at Beauxbatons, Harry felt something approach closure regarding the painful confrontations that had marked his break from the British magical system. Not forgiveness for the systematic abuse he had endured, but understanding that some of the adults who had enabled that abuse were capable of growth and change when confronted with clear evidence of their institutional failures. The afternoon light filtering through Beauxbatons' tall windows caught the silver threads in Harry's current transfiguration project, creating patterns that seemed to shift and dance with their own internal life. The beauty of the magic he was learning to create reflected the fundamental difference between education pursued by choice and education imposed by institutional requirement. At Beauxbatons, magic was taught as art and science simultaneously, encouraging students to explore the aesthetic dimensions of their abilities alongside the practical applications. Students learn to create beauty as well as achieve specific magical objectives, developing appreciation for the cultural and creative aspects of magical practice that had been largely absent from British magical education's focus on standardized techniques and competitive achievement. But it was the approach to defensive magic that provided the clearest illustration of how educational philosophy shaped not just academic outcomes, but fundamental character development. British magical education treated defensive magic as preparation for conflict, emphasizing techniques designed to defeat opponents and protect institutional interests through superior force and tactical advantage. Beauxbatons approached defensive magic as community protection, teaching techniques designed to create sanctuary and maintain peace through collaborative effort and shared responsibility. Students learned to work together to establish protective environments that served everyone's safety and well-being, rather than privileging some individuals or groups at the expense of others. The philosophical difference was profound and had practical implications that extended far beyond academic curriculum into fundamental questions about the purpose of magical education and the kind of magical society that educational institutions were preparing their students to create and maintain. Harry's growing mastery of collaborative protective magic reflected his personal transformation from someone who had been systematically isolated and made dependent on institutional approval to someone capable of contributing to community well-being through conscious choice and cooperative effort. As the academic day concluded and students began gathering their materials for evening study sessions, Harry reflected on the comprehensive changes that had occurred in his life during the year since his escape from Privet Drive. Not just the obvious improvements in his living conditions, educational opportunities, and social relationships, but the fundamental shift in his understanding of his own worth and agency. The scared, manipulated child who had accepted whatever treatment adults chose to provide had become someone capable of making informed decisions about his own future based on his genuine interests and carefully considered values. More importantly, he had learned to distinguish between adults who deserved his trust because they respected his autonomy and those who demanded his compliance because they claimed institutional authority. The evening meal at Beauxbatons provided daily opportunity for intellectual exchange and cultural learning that would have been impossible in the rigid social hierarchies that characterized British magical education. Students from different countries and magical traditions shared perspectives and experiences that enriched everyone's understanding of the diversity and complexity of magical practice throughout the international community. Harry found himself engaging in conversations about magical theory, international politics, cultural differences, and philosophical questions with the kind of intellectual confidence that could only develop in environments that encouraged curiosity and rewarded independent thinking. The contrast with his previous educational experience was so stark that he sometimes struggled to believe that both systems could claim to serve the same fundamental purposes. But it was the letter-writing session that had become part of his evening routine that provided the most meaningful connection to the broader impact his choices had created throughout the magical world. Each night, Harry responded to correspondence from magical children who had been inspired by his example or assisted through the Potter initiative that bore his name. The letters revealed individual stories of courage and transformation that demonstrated how personal decisions could trigger systemic changes that benefited entire communities. A girl from Eastern Europe, whose family had tried to force her into an arranged magical marriage, had used international protections established through Harry's case to pursue advanced magical education instead. A boy from South America, whose magical government had attempted to conscript him into military service, had found sanctuary and educational alternatives through the network of international schools that had developed in response to Harry's situation. Each success story reinforced Harry's understanding that individual resistance to institutional manipulation could create precedent and legal frameworks that protected others facing similar violations of their rights and dignity. As Harry completed his evening correspondence and prepared for the advanced study sessions that Beauxbatons students could pursue according to their individual interests and energy levels, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with the knowledge that his struggle for educational choice had created lasting changes that would benefit magical children for generations to come. The transformation was complete, but the work of building a magical world that respected individual dignity and supported personal development would continue for as long as young people had the courage to question adult authority and demand treatment that reflected their fundamental worth as human beings, capable of making informed decisions about their own lives and futures. 2 years after his escape from Privet Drive, Harry Potter stood in the witness chamber of the International Magical Tribunal in Geneva, delivering testimony that would finalize the most comprehensive reform of magical child welfare law in modern history. The ornate chamber, with its soaring crystal dome and walls lined with portraits of magical legal scholars from throughout history, had witnessed many landmark cases that reshaped international magical law. But never before had the assembled justices gathered to address systematic child abuse, orchestrated by someone whose international reputation had been built on principles of wisdom and protection. The transformation in Harry was visible to everyone present, from the confident way he held himself to the steady clarity with which he articulated complex legal and ethical concepts that would have challenged adults with decades more experience. The scared, manipulated child who had lived in a cupboard under the stairs had become a young man whose moral courage and intellectual development served as living proof that children could thrive when treated with respect and given genuine choices about their education and development. Chief Justice Delacroix, a distinguished witch whose silver hair and penetrating blue eyes reflected decades of experience with international magical law, addressed Harry with the respect typically reserved for expert witnesses rather than child victims seeking justice. "Mr. Potter," she said formally, her French accent lending additional gravity to words that would be recorded as part of international magical legal precedent, "your testimony and the evidence gathered through your case have led to the establishment of the International Magical Child Welfare Authority and comprehensive reforms in magical education throughout 47 participating nations. How do you assess the effectiveness of these changes in protecting magical children who might otherwise experience systematic manipulation and abuse?" The question represented formal acknowledgement that Harry's individual struggle for educational choice had created institutional changes that extended far beyond his personal circumstances to encompass fundamental reforms in how magical societies approached childhood, education, and individual rights. "Chief Justice Delacroix," Harry replied with the careful precision that had characterized all his interactions with international legal authorities. The establishment of mandatory oversight procedures and enforceable standards for magical child welfare has created legal frameworks that make systematic abuse significantly more difficult to perpetrate and maintain without detection. He paused, drawing on statistical data from the International Magical Child Welfare Authority that had been provided to support his testimony. In the 2 years since these protections were implemented, the authority has investigated over 800 cases of suspected child welfare violations and successfully intervened in 237 situations where magical children were being subjected to educational or placement arrangements that violated international standards for individual rights and family sovereignty. The numbers represented individual children whose lives had been changed through legal protections that originated in Harry's decision to challenge institutional manipulation rather than accepting predetermined destiny. Each successful intervention created precedent and strengthened enforcement mechanisms that made future violations more difficult to justify or sustain. But it was Harry's analysis of systemic changes in magical education that provided the most comprehensive assessment of how his case had reshaped international approaches to childhood and institutional authority. Perhaps more importantly, Chief Justice Delacroix, the requirement that magical educational institutions respect student preferences and family wishes regarding educational approaches has fundamentally altered the power dynamic between students and faculty throughout the international magical community. Harry gestured toward documentation that detailed policy changes implemented by magical schools across 6 continents in response to international pressure generated by his case. Students now understand that they have legal rights that cannot be violated simply because adults claim institutional authority or strategic wisdom. Faculty understand that educational practices must serve student development rather than institutional convenience. And families understand that magical ability doesn't automatically grant governmental or educational authorities the right to override parental wishes regarding child placement and development. The comprehensive nature of these changes reflected the depth of institutional transformation required to align magical education with international standards for child welfare and educational ethics that had been established through Harry's legal victory. Chief Justice Delacroix nodded gravely, recognizing that Harry's analysis demonstrated sophisticated understanding of legal and institutional dynamics that extended far beyond his personal experience with systematic manipulation and abuse. Mr. Potter, she continued, your establishment of the Potter Foundation for Magical Child Welfare has provided both financial and legal support for magical children seeking alternatives to educational arrangements that violate their rights or fail to serve their developmental needs. Can you describe how this foundation addresses systemic problems beyond individual intervention? The question reflected recognition that Harry's response to his own victimization had evolved beyond seeking personal justice to creating permanent structures that would protect other magical children from experiencing similar violations of their rights and dignity. Chief Justice Delacroix, Harry replied with quiet confidence. The Potter Foundation operates on the principle that systematic problems require systematic solutions that address root causes rather than simply responding to individual crises as they arise. He outlined the Foundation's comprehensive approach to magical child welfare reform, from legal advocacy and policy development to educational alternatives and family support services. The Foundation provides direct assistance to magical children who need immediate protection or educational alternatives, but it also works to identify and address institutional practices that create vulnerability to abuse and manipulation. We fund research into optimal educational approaches, support policy development that prioritizes child welfare over institutional convenience, and advocate for legal frameworks that recognize individual rights regardless of magical ability or symbolic importance. The systematic approach reflected Harry's understanding that individual cases of abuse and manipulation were symptoms of larger institutional problems that required structural reform rather than temporary intervention. But it was the Foundation's educational initiatives that demonstrated the most innovative approaches to magical child development, creating alternatives that prioritized individual agency and cultural diversity over institutional conformity and national isolation. We have established partnerships with progressive magical schools throughout the international community to create educational exchanges that allow magical children to experience different approaches to learning and development before making permanent decisions about their academic futures, Harry explained. The program addressed one of the fundamental problems that had made Harry vulnerable to manipulation, the assumption that children should accept whatever educational arrangements adults provided without understanding alternatives or having opportunity to make informed choices based on personal preferences and developmental needs. Additionally, the Foundation funds scholarship programs that ensure access to high-quality magical education, regardless of family financial circumstances or governmental political preferences. We believe that educational choice should be determined by student interests and capabilities rather than economic resources or institutional manipulation. The comprehensive approach to educational access and choice reflected lessons learned through Harry's own experience with systematic manipulation disguised as protection and guidance. Chief Justice Delacroix's final question addressed the broader implications of Harry's case for international magical law and the relationship between individual rights and institutional authority. "Mr. Potter," she said with formal dignity, "how do you believe your case has changed international understanding of the balance between child protection and individual agency in magical education and development?" The question was significant because it acknowledged that Harry's case had triggered fundamental reconsideration of philosophical assumptions about childhood, authority, and institutional responsibility that had governed magical societies for centuries. "Chief Justice Delacroix," Harry replied thoughtfully, "I believe my case has demonstrated that genuine child protection requires respecting individual agency rather than suppressing it. That authentic educational guidance involves expanding choices rather than limiting them, and that legitimate institutional authority must be accountable to the people it claims to serve rather than demanding unquestioned obedience." The philosophical framework reflected Harry's development from someone who accepted adult explanations without question to someone capable of independent moral and political analysis based on careful observation and systematic study. "Most importantly," Harry continued, "my experience has shown that children who are treated with respect and given genuine choices about their development become adults who are capable of making informed decisions and contributing positively to their communities. Systematic manipulation and control may produce compliance, but it does not produce the kind of independent thinking and moral courage that magical society needs to address complex challenges and maintain ethical standards." The analysis provided comprehensive justification for the legal and institutional reforms that had been implemented in response to Harry's case, demonstrating that protecting individual rights served broader social interests rather than conflicting with them. When Harry's formal testimony concluded, Chief Justice Delacroix delivered remarks that would be quoted in international magical law schools for generations to come, establishing legal precedent that fundamentally altered the relationship between institutional authority and individual rights throughout the magical community. Mr. Potter's case has demonstrated that systematic violation of child welfare laws represents not merely individual criminal conduct, but institutional failure that threatens the fundamental principles of justice and human dignity that underlie all legitimate governmental authority, she declared with the moral clarity that had made her one of the most respected magical legal scholars of her generation. The tribunal's final ruling established enforceable international standards for magical child welfare that superseded national sovereignty when fundamental rights were at stake, creating legal frameworks that would protect magical children from systematic manipulation and abuse, regardless of the institutional prestige or political influence of their perpetrators. But the most personally meaningful moment for Harry occurred after the formal proceedings concluded, when he was approached by a group of magical children who had travelled from around the world to witness the tribunal's final ruling on reforms that had been established through his courage and persistence. The young people, ranging in age from 9 to 16 and representing magical communities from every continent, had organised their presence at the tribunal through the international student networks that had developed in response to Harry's example and the educational alternatives created through the Potter Initiative. "Harry," said a serious-minded girl from Australia whose family had sent her to study at Beauxbatons after learning about educational alternatives through the Foundation's outreach programs, "we wanted you to know that your decision to challenge systematic manipulation has given magical children throughout the world the knowledge that we have rights that adults must respect and choices that institutions cannot override through claims of superior wisdom or strategic necessity." The statement was delivered with the kind of confident clarity that reflected educational environments that encouraged independent thinking and respectful treatment rather than demanding compliance and grateful acceptance of whatever adults chose to provide. A boy from Brazil stepped forward with the formal dignity that characterized international magical diplomatic communication, his voice carrying the weight of someone representing broader community interests rather than personal concerns. "The legal protections and educational alternatives established through your foundation have already helped over 1,000 magical children escape systematic manipulation and pursue development that reflects their genuine interests and capabilities rather than institutional convenience or political strategy," he said, with quiet pride. Each success story reinforced Harry's understanding that individual resistance to institutional manipulation could create precedent and legal frameworks that benefited entire communities and established permanent protections against systematic abuse. But it was the presence of Luna Lovegood, now a respected researcher in magical creature communication, whose work had attracted international attention and academic recognition, that provided the most powerful reminder of how educational choice and respectful treatment could allow individual potential to flourish in ways that would never have been possible under systematic suppression and control. Luna approached Harry with the serene confidence that had replaced her previous defensive isolation, her transformation serving as living proof that alternative educational environments could support development that honored individual differences rather than demanding conformity to institutional expectations. "Harry," she said, with the gentle wisdom that had always characterized her perspective despite the institutional bullying she had endured at Hogwarts, "your courage in questioning adult authority and demanding respectful treatment has taught magical children throughout the world that we don't have to accept systematic manipulation simply because adults claim to know what's best for us." The observation captured the fundamental shift in power dynamics that Harry's case had triggered throughout the international magical community, establishing that institutional authority required justification and accountability rather than automatic acceptance and grateful compliance. As the international gathering of magical children concluded their formal presentation to Harry, they announced the establishment of the International Magical Student Alliance, an organization dedicated to monitoring educational institutions and advocating for student rights throughout the global magical community. The alliance represented institutionalization of the student agency and collaborative advocacy that had emerged in response to Harry's example, creating permanent structures to ensure that the educational reforms triggered by his case would be maintained and expanded rather than gradually eroded through institutional resistance and political pressure. But the most significant development was the announcement that Harry had been selected to serve as the first Director of Student Advocacy for the International Magical Child Welfare Authority, a position created specifically to ensure that institutional reform efforts remained grounded in the actual experiences and perspectives of magical children rather than adult assumptions about their needs and interests. The appointment recognized Harry's unique combination of personal experience with systematic manipulation, legal knowledge gained through his involvement in international reform efforts, and demonstrated commitment to protecting other children from experiencing similar violations of their rights and dignity. As Harry accepted the appointment with the quiet ceremony that had characterized all his interactions with international institutions, he reflected on the comprehensive transformation that had occurred in his life during the 4 years since his rejection of the Hogwarts letter had triggered a revolution in magical education and child welfare law. The scared, manipulated child who had accepted whatever treatment adults chose to provide had become someone whose moral courage and intellectual development served as inspiration for magical children throughout the world who faced similar challenges with institutional manipulation and systematic suppression of their individual agency. More importantly, Harry had learned that his individual struggle for dignity and choice was part of larger patterns of institutional control and manipulation that affected communities throughout the magical world, and that challenging systematic abuse required not just personal courage, but collaborative effort and sustained commitment to reform that addressed root causes rather than individual symptoms. The evening celebration at Beauxbatons Academy, where Harry would complete his magical education before beginning his professional work with the International Magical Child Welfare Authority, reflected the international community that had formed around principles of educational choice, cultural diversity, and individual respect that his case had helped establish throughout the magical world. Students from dozens of countries gathered to celebrate not just Harry's appointment, but the broader success of reforms that had transformed magical education from systems designed to produce compliance into environments that fostered independent thinking, moral courage, and collaborative problem-solving. Fleur Delacour, now preparing for advanced studies in international magical law with plans to specialize in child welfare advocacy, delivered remarks that captured the significance of the evening for everyone who had been part of the transformation that began with Harry's individual decision to question institutional authority and demand respectful treatment. 4 years ago, she said, with the eloquence that had made her one of Beauxbatons' most respected student leaders, Harry Potter taught us that individual courage can create systemic change, that questioning authority is not rebellion, but responsibility, and that children who are treated with respect become adults capable of creating justice and maintaining ethical standards throughout their communities. The philosophical framework reflected understanding that personal and political transformation were interconnected, that individual dignity and community welfare were mutually reinforcing rather than competing values. Tonight, we celebrate not just Harry's achievements, but the achievements of every magical child who has found the courage to demand better treatment, every family who has chosen educational alternatives that serve their children's genuine interests, and every institution that has reformed its practices to prioritize student development over institutional convenience. As the celebration continued late into the evening, with music and conversation flowing seamlessly between multiple languages and magical traditions, Harry felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with the knowledge that his struggle for individual dignity had created lasting changes that would protect magical children for generations to come. The transformation was complete, but the work of building a magical world that respected individual agency and supported personal development according to each person's genuine interests and capabilities would continue as long as young people had the courage to question institutional authority and demand treatment that reflected their fundamental worth as human beings capable of making informed decisions about their own lives. Standing in the moonlight that streamed through Beauxbatons' tall windows, surrounded by friends who had chosen him freely and colleagues who respected his contributions to their shared work of educational and legal reform, Harry Potter understood that he had found not just his place in the magical world, but his purpose in helping others find theirs according to their own values and interests, rather than predetermined destinies imposed by adults who claimed to know what was best for people they had never bothered to understand as individuals. The revolution that had begun with his rejection of a single letter had become a transformation that would reshape magical society for generations to come, establishing that individual dignity was not negotiable and that institutional authority required accountability to the people it claimed to serve, rather than demanding unquestioned obedience from those whose lives it affected. The conversation Harry had demanded never materialized. Uncle Vernon's face had cycled through several shades of purple before settling on a mottled red that suggested either impending cardiac arrest or explosive rage. Aunt Petunia had retreated to the kitchen sink, where she stood washing the same plate with mechanical precision, her movements sharp and agitated. Both adults seemed to realize simultaneously that Harry's question about their bargain had crossed a line they weren't prepared to discuss. The comfortable dynamic of secrets and silence that had governed Number 4. Privet Drive for 11 years was cracking, and none of them quite knew how to navigate the new territory. Uncle Vernon had eventually retreated to his study, muttering about phone calls and arrangements, while Aunt Petunia had assigned Harry an endless list of garden chores that kept him visible from the kitchen window. The message was clear. Normal routines would continue until someone decided how to handle the unprecedented situation of Harry actually asking questions, but Harry had never been particularly good at following unspoken rules, and the revelation that his entire childhood had been orchestrated by unknown parties had lit a fire in his mind that no amount of weeding could extinguish. As he worked in the garden, pulling dandelions with more force than strictly necessary, his thoughts churned with possibilities he had never dared consider. The Hogwarts letter remained on the kitchen table like an unexploded bomb. Throughout the morning, more owls arrived with identical copies, each one adding to the growing tension that made the very air inside the house feel thick and oppressive. Uncle Vernon had taken to closing all the curtains, as if hiding from the birds might somehow make the problem disappear. By noon, Harry had counted 17 different owls perched around the property. They waited with supernatural patience, occasionally rotating positions but never leaving their posts. Their presence transformed the normally quiet suburban street into something that felt more like a magical siege. It was Mrs. Figg who provided the opportunity Harry needed. The elderly woman who lived 2 streets over had always been an unwelcome fixture in Harry's life. Whenever the Dursleys needed someone to watch him during Dudley's birthday parties or family outings, Mrs. Figg was their go-to solution. Her house smelled of cabbage and cats, and she had an unfortunate tendency to show Harry photographs of her various feline companions while serving tea that tasted like it had been strained through old socks. But today, when Mrs. Figg appeared at the front door with a covered casserole dish and concern etched into every line of her weathered face, she looked different somehow, more alert, more purposeful. Her pale blue eyes, usually vague and distracted, held a sharpness that reminded Harry uncomfortably of the owls surrounding the house. Uncle Vernon answered the door with the wariness of a man under siege. His voice carried forced normalcy that fooled absolutely no one. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Figg. Lovely day, isn't it? Nothing unusual happening here at all." Mrs. Figg's response was equally artificial, but underneath the suburban pleasantries, Harry detected something else, a current of meaning that flowed between the adults like a hidden conversation. "I brought you a casserole," she announced, loud enough for the entire street to hear. "Thought you might need some help today, what with all the excitement." The word excitement hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Mrs. Figg's eyes flicked toward the owls perched on the roof gutters, then back to Uncle Vernon's increasingly panicked expression. Her smile remained perfectly neighborly, but there was something almost predatory about the way she catalogued every detail of the scene. Harry, still kneeling in the garden with dirt under his fingernails, felt a chill run down his spine. Mrs. Figg wasn't just a neighbor offering help. She was someone who had been expecting this day, someone who understood exactly what the presence of magical owls meant, someone who had been watching him for far longer than he had ever realized. The conversation between Uncle Vernon and Mrs. Figg continued in the coded language of suburban neighbors, but Harry was no longer listening to their words. He was watching their body language, The way Mrs. Figg positioned herself to maintain visual contact with both Harry and the surrounding owls, the way Uncle Vernon's hands trembled as he accepted the casserole dish. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Mrs. Figg wasn't just a convenient babysitter. She was part of whatever surveillance network had been monitoring his childhood. The realization hit him like cold water. How many people in Little Whinging were actually just neighbors, and how many were operatives in some larger plan he was only beginning to understand? The thought was both terrifying and liberating. If he was surrounded by watchers, then his actions mattered more than he had ever imagined. But it also meant that every moment of his life had been observed, catalogued, reported to whoever had orchestrated his placement with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon retreated inside with the casserole, leaving Mrs. Figg standing on the front step. She made a show of admiring Aunt Petunia's prize-winning roses, but her attention kept drifting toward Harry. Finally, she approached the garden bed where he was working, her movements casual but purposeful. "You're growing up fast, Harry," she observed, her voice carrying undertones he had never noticed before. 11 years old today, isn't it? Such an important age for boys like you." Boys like you. The phrase hit Harry with unexpected force. Mrs. Figg knew, had always known. Her babysitting services, her conveniently timed visits, her detailed knowledge of his whereabouts and activities. She wasn't just a neighbor who helped the Dursleys manage their unwanted nephew. She was a professional. Harry looked up from the weeds he had been pulling, meeting Mrs. Figg's eyes directly for perhaps the first time in his life. Her expression shifted subtly, and he saw recognition there. Recognition that he was finally old enough to start seeing the patterns that had shaped his world. "Mrs. Figg," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos of thoughts in his head. "How long have you been watching me?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. Mrs. Figg's carefully maintained facade of dotty neighbor lady flickered, revealing something sharper underneath. Her voice, when she responded, carried the weight of someone who had been waiting 11 years for this conversation. "Since the night you arrived," she admitted, abandoning all pretense of suburban small talk. "Since Dumbledore placed you here and asked me to keep an eye on things, to make sure you stayed safe and grew up properly." The casual way she dropped Dumbledore's name into conversation felt like a physical blow. Harry's world tilted again as another assumption crumbled. The mysterious headmaster, who had apparently orchestrated his childhood, wasn't some distant figure working through intermediaries. He had people embedded in Harry's daily life, watching his every move, reporting back on his development. Harry's voice came out smaller than he intended, but carrying an edge that surprised both of them. And what exactly did properly mean in this context? Mrs. Figg. Her expression softened with something that might have been sympathy, but her words remained matter of fact. It meant making sure you didn't ask too many questions, making sure you understood your place in the world, making sure that when the time came, you would be grateful for any alternative to your current circumstances. The honesty was brutal and somehow refreshing after years of careful lies and misdirection. Mrs. Figg was confirming what Harry had already begun to suspect. His misery hadn't been accidental or even the natural result of the Dursleys' prejudices. It had been cultivated, maintained, and monitored to produce a specific psychological result. Harry stood up from the garden bed, brushing dirt from his knees with movements that felt strangely ceremonial. Around them, the owls continued their patient vigil, but their presence no longer felt quite so threatening. They were just messengers, after all. The real architects of his situation were people like Mrs. Figg, people who smiled and offered casseroles while cataloguing every detail of his emotional development. He looked at Mrs. Figg with new eyes, seeing past the carefully constructed persona to the professional observer underneath. She wasn't cruel, he realized. She was just thorough, just following orders from someone who had made decisions about Harry's life before Harry was old enough to have opinions about anything. "Mrs. Figg," Harry said, his voice gaining strength with each word, What happens if I don't want to go to Hogwarts? Her reaction was immediate and telling. The mask of neighborly concern slipped completely, revealing genuine alarm. She glanced toward the house, then toward the owls, then back to Harry with an expression that suggested his question had never been contemplated as a possibility. "That's not really an option, dear," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Professor Dumbledore has plans for you. Important plans. The whole wizarding world is counting on you to fulfill your destiny." Destiny. The word settled over Harry like a straitjacket. Not choice, not opportunity, not even obligation. Destiny implied that his future had been predetermined, that his role had been written before he was old enough to hold a quill. Harry felt something crystallize in his chest, cold and hard and absolutely immovable. He looked at Mrs. Figg, at the house where the Dursleys were pretending to ignore the magical chaos surrounding them, at the owls who waited for his compliance with supernatural patience. "What if I have different plans?" he said quietly. Mrs. Figg's response came too quickly, as if it were something she had been trained to say. "You don't understand the wizarding world, Harry. You don't know what's out there, what dangers exist, what responsibilities come with your name and your history. Professor Dumbledore knows what's best for you." But Harry was done accepting other people's definitions of what was best for him. He had spent 11 years being told he should be grateful for scraps, grateful for basic necessities, grateful for the privilege of existing in a world that clearly didn't want him. Now he was being told he should be grateful for a rescue that felt suspiciously like another form of control. The pattern was becoming clear, and Harry didn't like what he saw. He left Mrs. Figg standing in the garden and walked toward the house with purpose that surprised him. The kitchen felt different now, charged with possibility rather than oppression. The Hogwarts letter still sat on the table, but it no longer looked like an invitation. It looked like a summons from people who had never bothered to ask what he actually wanted. Harry picked up the letter and read it again, this time paying attention to the assumptions embedded in every line. "Your acceptance has been confirmed, not offered." Confirmed, as if his attendance had never been in question. "Term begins September 1st. Tember, not if you choose to attend. When you attend. Please find enclosed a list of necessary books and equipment. Not suggested materials. Necessary." Compliance was assumed. The letter was beautifully crafted and completely impersonal, the correspondence equivalent of a polite kidnapping. Someone had made decisions about his education, his future, his entire life trajectory, without ever consulting the person most affected by those choices. Uncle Vernon appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face still carrying the strained expression of a man barely holding on to his composure. When he saw Harry holding the letter, his shoulders sagged with something that looked like defeat. "You'll go then," he said, more statement than question. "You'll take their offer and leave us to deal with whatever consequences they decide we deserve." Harry looked at his uncle, really looked at him, and saw something he had never noticed before. Fear, yes, but underneath that, something that might have been genuine concern. Uncle Vernon was terrified, not just of the magical world in general, but of what might happen to Harry specifically once he left the dubious protection of Privet Drive. The realization shifted something in Harry's perception. Uncle Vernon wasn't just a cruel guardian who enjoyed making Harry's life miserable. He was a man who had been placed in an impossible situation and told to follow instructions he didn't understand for reasons no one had bothered to explain. "Uncle Vernon," Harry said carefully, "what exactly did they tell you would happen to me?" Uncle Vernon's response came out in a rush, as if the words had been building pressure for years. "They said you were special, said you had a destiny to fulfill and enemies who would try to stop you. Said the only way to keep you safe was to make sure you grew up normal, humble, grateful for any help you received." He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Normal. As if anything about this situation could ever be normal. As if raising a magical child while pretending magic didn't exist could produce anything resembling a well-adjusted human being. Harry felt a strange sympathy for his uncle, mixed with a growing rage at the people who had put them all in this position. The Dursleys had been given an impossible task, and threatened with unspecified consequences if they failed to comply. Harry had been denied any agency in his own life. And somewhere, people with impressive titles and unshakable certainty about what was best for everyone continued to manipulate lives like pieces on a chessboard. The unfairness of it all settled over Harry like a physical weight. But underneath the anger, something else was growing. Determination. The absolute refusal to continue being a passive participant in his own life story. He looked at the Hogwarts letter one more time, then set it back on the table with careful precision. Uncle Vernon watched him with growing confusion as Harry moved toward the door. "Where are you going?" Uncle Vernon asked, and for the first time in Harry's memory, his voice carried genuine concern rather than irritation. Harry paused in the doorway, looking back at the man who had made his childhood miserable on orders from people who claimed to have his best interests at heart. "To the library," he said simply. "I need to do some research before I make any decisions about my future." The word decisions hung in the air like a revolution. Uncle Vernon's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something that looked almost like respect. "Be careful, boy," Uncle Vernon said quietly. "People like them don't like it when people like us start asking questions." Harry nodded, understanding passing between them for the first time in 11 years. Then he walked out the front door, past Mrs. Figg, who was still standing in the garden, looking shell-shocked, past the owls who watched his every movement with unnerving intelligence. Behind him, number 4 Privet Drive contained the wreckage of 11 years of carefully maintained lies. Ahead of him lay the little whinging public library and the possibility of answers that no one had bothered to provide. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was going to research his own future before letting other people determine it for him. The owls followed at a discreet distance, but Harry no longer cared about surveillance. He had questions that needed answers, and for the first time in his life, he intended to find them himself. The little whinging public library had never been a place Harry associated with revolution, but as he pushed through the heavy glass doors 3 hours after his conversation with Mrs. Figg, it felt like entering a fortress of possibility. The familiar smell of old books and industrial carpet cleaner wrapped around him like armor against the chaos he had left behind at Privet Drive. Behind him, the magical siege continued. When he had last looked back, 17 owls had grown to 23, perched on rooftops and fence posts with the patience of creatures who understood that time worked differently for them than it did for humans. Mrs. Figg had retreated to her own house, but Harry could feel her eyes tracking his movement from behind lace curtains that twitched whenever he shifted position. The library offered sanctuary, and something infinitely more valuable, unrestricted access to information that no one had filtered, edited, or curated for his consumption. For the first time in his life, Harry could ask questions and pursue answers without someone else determining what he needed to know. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, barely looked up from her cataloguing as Harry approached the reference desk. She was a small woman with steel-grey hair and the kind of practical demeanor that suggested she had seen every possible variety of human desperation manifest itself through book requests. "Mrs. Chen," Harry said, trying to project more confidence than he felt, "I need information about international schools, specifically schools in France." She gestured toward the computer terminals without breaking rhythm in her typing. International education resources are accessible through the main database. Use keywords like boarding schools, international education, France. The computers have internet access if you need to search beyond our catalogue. Internet access. Harry felt something approaching euphoria at the words. The Dursleys had always claimed that internet service was too expensive and unnecessary for someone like Harry. Now he understood that their technological limitation hadn't been about money. It had been about control, about ensuring that Harry's access to information remained carefully managed until the moment when his handlers wanted to reveal specific truths. Harry claimed a computer terminal in the back corner of the library, positioning himself where he could watch both the entrance and the windows. The surveillance skills he had developed during 11 years of avoiding Dudley's gang served him well now that the stakes were considerably higher. The first search for French boarding schools yielded predictable results. Expensive institutions catering to diplomatic families and international business executives. Schools that emphasized traditional academic excellence and cultural immersion. Nothing that seemed relevant to someone fleeing a predetermined magical destiny. But Harry had learned to read between lines, to notice what people didn't say, as much as what they did. The Dursleys had always been careful to avoid discussing his parents' background in any detail, beyond the standard story about the car crash. Mrs. Figg had revealed that Professor Dumbledore was involved in decisions about Harry's placement and education. Logic suggested that whatever had killed his parents was connected to the magical world that was now demanding his participation. If magic was real, and if there were magical schools, then perhaps there were multiple magical schools. Perhaps the choice wasn't simply between Hogwarts and nothing. Perhaps there were alternatives that his handlers hadn't bothered to mention because they preferred to limit his options. Harry refined his search parameters, looking for elite schools in France that accepted international students and maintained secretive admission processes. Schools that might exist parallel to the mainstream educational system, serving populations that ordinary reference materials wouldn't acknowledge. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A travel blog written by someone identifying themselves only as Marie B. contained a casual mention of visiting her cousin at the academy in the mountains near the Spanish border. The phrasing was deliberately vague, but something about it triggered Harry's pattern recognition instincts. Further searching revealed scattered references to an institution that seemed to exist in the margins of official recognition. Academic papers mentioned specialized educational facilities in the Pyrenees region. Tourism websites referenced exclusive mountain retreats that weren't open to casual visitors. Discussion forums contained conversations that stopped abruptly whenever specific details were requested. The pattern was familiar. Information that was simultaneously hidden and accessible, visible only to people who knew the right questions to ask. Harry had spent 11 years navigating the coded communication systems of adults who thought children couldn't understand subtext. This felt similar, but larger in scale. A name emerged from the research: Beauxbatons Academy of Magic. The moment Harry found the first direct reference, everything changed. Not just the search results, which suddenly became more specific and detailed, but something in the air around him. A subtle shift in temperature, a change in the quality of light filtering through the library windows, as if the universe itself was responding to his discovery. Beauxbatons Academy of Magic, founded in the 13th century, serving students from across Europe and accepting international applicants based on magical aptitude and academic merit. Located in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain, the school maintained a tradition of excellence in magical education while fostering cultural exchange and international cooperation. The language was formal and institutional, but underneath the bureaucratic phrasing, Harry detected something that had been completely absent from the Hogwarts letter: choice, agency, the suggestion that students were selected based on merit rather than destiny, that education was something pursued rather than something imposed. More importantly, the admission process was described as competitive and ongoing. Students could apply at any time during their educational years, not just at age 11. Applications were evaluated based on magical aptitude, academic potential, and personal statement. No mention of predetermined acceptance, no assumption of compliance. Harry's heart rate accelerated as the implications became clear. Hogwarts wasn't his only option. The magical world wasn't a monolith controlled by Professor Dumbledore and his associates. There were alternatives, institutions that operated according to different principles, serving students who had made conscious choices about their education rather than simply accepting assigned destinies. The application requirements for Beauxbatons were refreshingly straightforward. demonstration of magical ability, academic transcripts, and a personal essay explaining the applicant's educational goals and cultural interests. No mention of special status or predetermined roles. No emphasis on duty or destiny. For the first time since the morning's chaos began, Harry felt something approaching hope. He spent the next hour researching everything he could find about Beauxbatons Academy. The school's approach to magical education emphasized practical application and international cooperation. Students were encouraged to maintain connections with their home cultures while developing appreciation for magical diversity. Academic freedom and intellectual curiosity were valued above compliance and tradition. The contrast with what he had observed about the British magical establishment was striking. Where Hogwarts seemed to assume that students would fit into predetermined roles, Beauxbatons appeared to celebrate individual development and cross-cultural understanding. Where the Hogwarts letter had demanded compliance, Beauxbatons invited participation. But the most significant difference was philosophical. Beauxbatons' materials consistently emphasized choice and personal agency. Students were expected to take responsibility for their own learning and development. Education was presented as a collaborative process between institution and individual, not something imposed by authorities who claimed to know what was best. Harry found himself imagining a different kind of magical education. Classes taught in multiple languages, students from different countries sharing perspectives and traditions, professors who encouraged questions rather than demanding obedience, an environment where magical ability was developed through exploration and experimentation rather than rigid adherence to established methods. The fantasy was intoxicating, but Harry forced himself to remain practical. Wanting something different didn't make it achievable. Even if Beauxbatons represented everything that Hogwarts apparently wasn't, that didn't mean they would accept a student who was fleeing rather than choosing their institution. More importantly, there was the question of how Professor Dumbledore and his associates would respond to Harry pursuing unauthorized alternatives. The surveillance network that had monitored his childhood wouldn't simply disappear because he had discovered other options. If anything, attempting to circumvent their plans might trigger more aggressive intervention. But as Harry stared at the Beauxbatons application materials displayed on the computer screen, he realized that those concerns were exactly the kind of thinking that had kept him compliant for 11 years. Fear of consequences, assumption that other people's plans took precedence over his own desires, acceptance that his role was to react rather than to choose. The pattern was familiar, and Harry was done being trapped by it. He printed the Beauxbatons application materials, using the library's public printing services to create physical copies that couldn't be digitally tracked or remotely deleted. The papers felt substantial in his hands, proof that alternatives existed, even if the people controlling his life preferred that he not know about them. The personal essay requirement presented both opportunity and challenge. How did someone explain their educational goals when their entire educational experience had been designed to limit their aspirations? How did someone describe their cultural interests when they had been systematically isolated from their own heritage? But perhaps that was exactly what Beauxbatons needed to understand. Not Harry's manufactured gratitude for whatever opportunities were offered, but his authentic hunger for choices that had been deliberately withheld. Not his compliance with other people's expectations, but his determination to forge his own path forward. Harry began composing his essay in his mind as he gathered the printed materials. Not the careful, modest language that the Dursleys had trained him to use when making any kind of request. Not the grateful acceptance that Professor Dumbledore's associates clearly expected. Something honest and uncompromising that reflected his actual thoughts rather than what adults wanted to hear. The library's closing time approached faster than Harry had anticipated. Mrs. Chen announced the final warning in her crisp, professional voice, and Harry realized that he had been researching for over 4 hours. The day had shifted toward evening, while he was absorbed in discovering possibilities that no one had bothered to mention existed. He walked home through streets that felt different now that he understood the scope of his situation. The owls were still there, maintaining their vigil with supernatural patience, but their presence no longer felt quite so oppressive. They were messengers for one particular institution, not representatives of the entire magical world. Mrs. Figg's house showed lights in multiple windows, and Harry could see movement behind the curtains that suggested she was entertaining visitors, probably reporting on his afternoon activities to whoever maintained oversight of the surveillance network. Harry no longer cared about hiding his actions. If they wanted to know what he was thinking and planning, they could ask him directly, instead of relying on second-hand observations. Number 4. Privet Drive had acquired additional owls during his absence. The flock now covered most of the available perching surfaces around the property, creating a scene that looked like something from a nature documentary about unusual bird behavior. The neighbors had begun gathering in small groups, pointing and speculating about the unprecedented avian invasion. Uncle Vernon opened the front door before Harry could reach for his key, his expression cycling through relief, anxiety, and something that might have been respect. "The boy's got a backbone after all," he muttered, loud enough for Harry to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Aunt Petunia moved through her evening routines with mechanical precision, but her usual brittle energy had been replaced by something approaching resignation. She glanced toward Harry occasionally, but without the usual undercurrent of resentment. It was as if his afternoon of independent research had changed her perception of him from unwanted burden to something more complex and potentially dangerous. The Hogwarts letters had multiplied during Harry's absence. The kitchen table now held 17 identical envelopes, arranged in neat rows that suggested someone had been organizing them while waiting for Harry's return. The precision of the arrangement felt slightly threatening, as if the letters were trying to communicate their own patience and persistence. Harry sat at the kitchen table and began opening the letters methodically. Each one contained identical text, but the accumulation created a psychological pressure that was clearly intentional. Whoever was responsible for the letter campaign understood that repetition and persistence could break down resistance more effectively than single dramatic gestures. But Harry was no longer impressed by magical displays or institutional pressure tactics. He had spent the afternoon learning about alternatives, and the knowledge had fundamentally shifted his relationship to the situation. The letters weren't demands from an unquestionable authority. They were job offers from one institution among many, and he was under no obligation to accept employment terms that didn't serve his interests. He set the letters aside and pulled out the Beauxbatons application materials he had printed at the library. The contrast was immediate and striking. Where the Hogwarts letters demanded compliance through repetition and implied threats, the Beauxbatons materials invited participation through information and genuine choice. Uncle Vernon appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sound of papers rustling. When he saw Harry studying the foreign application materials, his expression shifted to something approaching panic. "Those aren't from the school that's been sending the letters," he observed, stating the obvious in a tone that suggested larger implications. "No," Harry agreed, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "These are from Beauxbatons Academy of Magic in France. They have an international admission process that allows students to apply based on merit rather than predetermined destiny." The word destiny hung in the air like a challenge. Uncle Vernon's face cycled through several emotions before settling on something that looked almost like pride. "You're rejecting them," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I'm exploring my options," Harry corrected, which apparently is something I should have been doing all along, instead of waiting for other people to make decisions about my future. Uncle Vernon sat down heavily at the kitchen table, his bulky frame making the wooden chair creak in protest. For 11 years, he had been following instructions from people who claimed to know what was best for Harry. For 11 years, he had been told that his role was to maintain specific conditions and await further directions. Now Harry was demonstrating that alternatives existed, that choices could be made, that the carefully constructed system of control wasn't as absolute as its architects had implied. Uncle Vernon looked simultaneously terrified and relieved, as if a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying had suddenly been lifted. "What happens if you apply to this French school?" Uncle Vernon asked, his voice careful and measured. Harry considered the question seriously. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know what happens if I don't. I become whatever Professor Dumbledore has decided I should become, whether that serves my interests or not. I spend my life following plans that other people made without bothering to consult me." Uncle Vernon nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that had never existed before. "Boy," he said quietly, speaking with a sincerity that Harry had never heard from him, "I think your parents would be proud of you for asking these questions." The words hit Harry harder than he had expected. For 11 years, Uncle Vernon had used Harry's parents as a weapon, turning their memory into something shameful and dangerous. This was the first time he had ever suggested that James and Lily Potter might have approved of anything Harry did. It was also the first time Harry had considered that his parents might not have wanted him to accept whatever fate other people prescribed for him, that they might have valued his agency and independence more than his compliance with institutional expectations. The thought crystallized into resolution. He would apply to Beauxbatons Academy, not as a rejection of magic or magical education, but as an assertion of his right to choose his own path forward. Not as rebellion for its own sake, but as the logical extension of questions he should have been asking all along. The owls outside continued their patient vigil, but Harry no longer felt intimidated by their persistence. They were just messengers after all. The real power lay in deciding which messages deserved responses and which could be safely ignored. For the first time in his 11 years of life, Harry Potter was going to make an educational choice based on his own research and judgment, rather than other people's expectations and predetermined plans. The revolution had officially begun. Harry Potter had never written a letter that mattered before. Every school assignment, every required thank you note to distant relatives, every piece of correspondence in his 11 years had been carefully supervised and edited by adults who ensured that his words reflected appropriate humility and gratitude. But the letter he composed the morning after his library revelation was entirely his own. The rejection letter to Professor McGonagall took 3 drafts before Harry achieved the tone he wanted. Not hostile, which would invite confrontation he wasn't prepared for. Not apologetic, which would suggest that his decision was tentative rather than final. Something polite but uncompromising that made clear his choice was deliberate and informed rather than impulsive rebellion. Dear Professor McGonagall, the final version began. Thank you for your letter regarding admission to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. After careful consideration, I must respectfully decline your offer of enrollment. Harry had debated whether to provide specific reasons for his refusal, ultimately deciding that detailed explanations would only create opportunities for counter-arguments and manipulation. Instead, he kept his reasoning simple and personal. I have found the living arrangements provided for my childhood to be incompatible with the kind of educational environment I believe would best serve my development. I am pursuing alternative options that better align with my personal and academic goals. The phrase living arrangements was deliberately vague while carrying clear implications. Anyone who had approved Harry's placement with the Dursleys would understand exactly what he was referencing without him having to catalogue specific instances of neglect and emotional abuse. He sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to Professor M. McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Scotland. The address felt incomplete somehow, lacking street numbers or postal codes, but the OWL delivery system apparently operated according to different principles than regular mail. Harry attached the envelope to the leg of the most patient-looking owl perched outside his bedroom window, a magnificent grey and brown creature that regarded him with unsettling intelligence. The bird accepted its burden with dignity and launched itself into the morning sky, disappearing toward the north with purposeful flight that suggested it knew exactly where Hogwarts could be found. The response came faster than Harry had anticipated possible. Less than 2 hours after dispatching his rejection letter, a sharp crack echoed through number 4 Privet Drive, followed immediately by Uncle Vernon's bellow of alarm from the living room. Harry raced downstairs to find a tall, severe-looking woman standing in the middle of the sitting room, her emerald robes somehow managing to look both elegant and practical, despite their obvious foreignness to suburban Surrey. Professor McGonagall, for this could only be she, surveyed the Dursley living room with an expression that suggested she was cataloguing evidence for future reference. Her sharp eyes took in the multiple locks on the cupboard under the stairs, the pristine condition of furnishings that clearly saw little use, the complete absence of anything that might suggest a child lived in the house. Uncle Vernon stood frozen by his armchair, his face cycling through shades of purple that indicated either imminent cardiac arrest or explosive rage. Aunt Petunia had retreated to the kitchen doorway, where she clutched a tea towel like a shield against magical contamination. Professor McGonagall's attention fixed on Harry with laser intensity that made him understand why students at Hogwarts might find her intimidating. But Harry had spent 11 years learning to read adult emotions beneath their official presentations, and underneath McGonagall's stern authority, he detected something unexpected. Genuine confusion mixed with what might have been concern. "Mr. Potter," she said, her Scottish accent lending additional gravity to words that were already weighted with institutional authority. "I received your letter this morning, and I must admit to being somewhat perplexed by its contents. Perhaps we might discuss your concerns in a more private setting." The suggestion felt more like a command, but Harry had prepared for this possibility during his anxious morning wait. He had expected that rejecting Hogwarts would trigger some kind of immediate response, though he had imagined it would involve more letters rather than personal visits from senior faculty. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said, keeping his voice respectful but firm, "I appreciate you coming all this way to discuss my decision. But I believe my letter expressed my position quite clearly. I will not be attending Hogwarts this year or any other year." McGonagall's eyebrows rose slightly, and Harry caught a glimpse of what might have been surprise. Clearly, she had expected his refusal to be tentative, something that could be overcome through proper explanation and persuasion. The possibility that an 11-year-old might make a firm, final decision about his magical education had apparently not occurred to her. "Mr. Potter," she continued, her tone becoming more pedagogical, "I think perhaps you do not fully understand what you are refusing. Hogwarts is not simply a school. It is your heritage, your birthright, the place where your parents met and fell in love. To reject Hogwarts is to reject your place in the magical world itself." The emotional manipulation was skillfully deployed, but Harry had been analyzing adult persuasion techniques for years. McGonagall was appealing to sentiment, family loyalty, and tribal belonging, while avoiding any acknowledgement of the concerns he had actually raised in his letter. "Professor McGonagall," Harry responded, his voice gaining confidence, "my parents may have attended Hogwarts, but they also died when I was a baby. I have no memories of them or their relationship to your school. What I do have are 11 years of experience with the living arrangements that Hogwarts approved for my childhood." He gestured toward the cupboard under the stairs, its multiple locks clearly visible from where they stood. "I spent most of my life sleeping in that cupboard, Professor McGonagall. Did anyone from Hogwarts ever check on those living arrangements? Did anyone verify that the people responsible for my care were actually caring for me?" McGonagall's expression shifted subtly, and Harry saw recognition there. Not surprise, he realized. She had known, perhaps not the specific details, but she had been aware that his situation was problematic and had chosen to follow institutional policy rather than intervening. The knowledge hit Harry like cold water. McGonagall wasn't discovering his mistreatment for the first time. She was being confronted with it after years of looking the other way, because Professor Dumbledore had decided that Harry's suffering served some larger purpose. "Professor," Harry continued, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of what he was revealing, "did you know that my relatives were paid to keep me here? Did you know that they were given specific instructions about how to raise me? Did you know that someone has been watching me my entire life to make sure I developed exactly the kind of gratitude and compliance that would make me eager to accept whatever Hogwarts offered?" McGonagall's face had gone pale, but her voice remained controlled. "Mr. Potter, the arrangements for your care were made by Professor Dumbledore himself. I assure you that everything was done with your best interests in mind. The magical world can be dangerous for someone of your significance, and protection was paramount. Protection. The word that had been used to justify 11 years of emotional neglect and systematic isolation. Harry felt something crystallize in his chest, cold and hard and utterly unmovable. Protection from what, Professor McGonagall? From learning that I had choices? From understanding my own history and heritage? From developing the kind of confidence and independence that might make me question institutional authority? The questions hung in the air like accusations, which Harry supposed they were. McGonagall's carefully maintained composure flickered, revealing something underneath that looked almost like shame. Harry pressed his advantage, driven by 11 years of suppressed anger and the new understanding that his suffering had been deliberately orchestrated. "You say Hogwarts is my birthright, Professor. But birthright implies inheritance, something passed down by family choice. What I received was assignment, something imposed by institutional decree. There's a difference." Uncle Vernon, who had been standing frozen throughout the exchange, suddenly found his voice. "The boy's right," he said, his words carrying a weight that surprised everyone in the room. "We were told to keep him humble, keep him grateful, make sure he'd jump at the first opportunity to escape. 11 years of following orders from people who never bothered to explain why breaking a child's spirit served anyone's interests." McGonagall turned toward Uncle Vernon with an expression that suggested she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Her voice, when she responded, carried a careful neutrality that indicated she was walking through a minefield of institutional responsibility and personal conscience. "Mr. Dursley, I believe there may have been some misunderstanding about the guidance provided for Harry's care. Professor Dumbledore's instructions were focused on protection and safety, not on deliberately limiting the boy's development." Uncle Vernon's laugh contained no humor whatsoever. "Misunderstanding," he repeated. "Lady, I have written records of every conversation, every instruction, every payment made to secure our compliance. Your Professor Dumbledore was very specific about what kind of person he wanted Harry to become, and grateful compliance was at the top of the list." Harry watched McGonagall's face as the full implications of Uncle Vernon's statement sank in. Whatever instructions she thought had been given to the Dursleys, the reality was apparently much more explicit and controlling than she had realized. Her institutional loyalty was warring with growing evidence that those institutions had operated in ways that violated her personal ethical standards. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said quietly, "I understand that you probably believed you were acting in my best interests. But I need you to understand something fundamental about my decision. I am not rejecting magical education. I am rejecting educational institutions that believe children should be grateful for whatever adults choose to provide, regardless of whether those choices actually serve the child's well-being." The distinction was crucial, and Harry could see that McGonagall understood its importance. He wasn't an ungrateful child throwing away opportunities. He was someone making informed choices about his future based on direct experience with institutional decision-making. McGonagall was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes moving between Harry and the evidence of his childhood visible throughout the Dursley living room. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, less institutional authority and more personal reflection. "Mr. Potter," she said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing to do about your magical education? The ministry requires that all magical children receive appropriate instruction. Simply refusing to attend school is not a viable long-term solution. Harry had been waiting for this question, and his answer was ready. I am applying to Beauxbatons Academy of Magic in France. They have an international admissions process that evaluates students based on merit and personal statement rather than predetermined destiny. I believe their educational philosophy better aligns with my goals and values. The silence that followed his announcement was so complete that Harry could hear Aunt Petunia's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen doorway. McGonagall's expression cycled through several emotions before settling on something approaching dismay. "Mr. Potter," she said slowly, "Beauxbatons is indeed an excellent institution. However, Professor Dumbledore has made specific arrangements for your education and protection that extend beyond simple school choice. There are factors at work that you may not fully understand." "Factors that no one has bothered to explain," Harry countered. "Professor McGonagall, I have spent my entire life being told that other people know what's best for me, that my role is to accept what I'm given and be grateful for it, that asking questions about decisions that affect my life is inappropriate and ungrateful." He straightened his shoulders, drawing on every ounce of confidence his afternoon of research had provided. "I reject that framework entirely. I am 11 years old, not 11 months old. I am capable of understanding explanations, evaluating options, and making informed choices. If Professor Dumbledore has concerns about my safety or education, he can discuss them with me directly, rather than manipulating my circumstances to force compliance." McGonagall looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Clearly, the possibility that Harry might demand direct communication with Dumbledore rather than accepting institutional mediation had never occurred to her. The magical world's approach to childhood apparently assumed that young people would accept adult authority without question. "Mr. Potter," McGonagall began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider her words carefully. "Professor Dumbledore is an extremely busy man, with responsibilities that extend far beyond any individual student's preferences. His guidance regarding your education and protection is based on knowledge and experience that spans decades of magical conflict and resolution." Harry felt his temper flare at the casual dismissal of his concerns as mere preferences, but he had learned enough about institutional power to recognize when direct confrontation would be counterproductive. Instead, he chose a different approach. "Professor McGonagall," he said, his voice remaining respectful, but carrying an edge of steel, "I am sure Professor Dumbledore is very busy and very knowledgeable, but his knowledge apparently did not prevent him from placing me with relatives who locked me in a cupboard and followed explicit instructions to break my spirit. His experience apparently did not suggest that monitoring my mistreatment without intervention might create trust issues that would complicate future cooperation." Each word hit McGonagall like a physical blow, and Harry could see her institutional certainty cracking under the weight of evidence she could no longer ignore. Her voice, when she responded, carried a note of genuine distress. "Mr. Potter, I believe there may have been significant miscommunication about the guidance provided to your relatives. If you have indeed been mistreated, that was never the intention of any arrangements made for your care." Harry studied McGonagall's face and saw someone grappling with the possibility that institutions she trusted had operated in ways that violated her fundamental values. Her distress appeared genuine, which suggested that the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation had not been shared with all members of the Hogwarts faculty. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said gently, recognizing an opportunity to build alliance rather than simply win arguments, "I believe you when you say that mistreating me was not your intention. But intention and impact are different things. What matters now is how we move forward with full knowledge of what actually happened rather than what was supposed to happen." McGonagall nodded slowly, and Harry saw recognition there. recognition that he was offering her a way to maintain her integrity while acknowledging institutional failure, recognition that his refusal to attend Hogwarts wasn't rebellion against her personally, but a rational response to systematic problems. "Professor," Harry continued, "if Professor Dumbledore truly believes that my safety requires specific arrangements, then he should be willing to discuss those arrangements directly with me. If Hogwarts truly offers the best magical education available, then it should be able to compete for my enrollment on the merits, rather than relying on manufactured desperation and limited alternatives." The challenge was clear and reasonable, and McGonagall could hardly object to the principle without undermining her own institution, but Harry could see her struggling with the implications. Treating Harry as someone capable of informed consent about his own life would require fundamental changes in how the magical world approached childhood and institutional authority. McGonagall stood quietly for several minutes, her expression suggesting intense internal debate. Finally, she reached a decision that seemed to surprise her as much as anyone else in the room. "Mr. Potter," she said formally, "I will convey your concerns and requirements to Professor Dumbledore personally. In the meantime, I believe it would be appropriate to postpone any final decisions about your education until all relevant parties have had opportunity for direct communication." It wasn't the immediate capitulation Harry had hoped for, but it was acknowledgement that his concerns deserved serious consideration, rather than dismissal. More importantly, it was recognition that he had the right to demand direct communication with the people making decisions about his life. "Thank you, Professor McGonagall," Harry said sincerely. "I appreciate your willingness to facilitate that conversation. In the meantime, I will continue pursuing my application to Beauxbatons as a backup plan, since I believe it's important to have alternatives available." McGonagall's expression suggested that she understood exactly what Harry's backup plan represented. If Dumbledore proved unwilling or unable to justify his approach through direct dialogue, Harry would simply remove himself from the British magical system entirely. The threat was polite but unmistakable, and it fundamentally changed the power dynamic that had governed Harry's life for 11 years. McGonagall departed with another sharp crack, leaving behind a living room that felt charged with possibility rather than oppression. Uncle Vernon sank into his armchair with an expression of amazed respect. "Boy," he said quietly, "I think you just backed the most powerful wizard in Britain into a corner using nothing but logic and reasonable expectations." Harry considered the assessment and realized that Uncle Vernon was probably right, but more importantly, he had demonstrated to himself that institutional authority was not unquestionable, that adult plans were not automatically superior to careful thinking, and that his own judgment was worth defending. The revolution was accelerating, and Harry Potter was no longer content to be a passive participant in his own life story. The arrival of Albus Dumbledore at No. 4 Privet Drive was preceded by phenomena that defied every natural law Harry thought he understood about the world. The streetlights along Privet Drive began flickering in synchronized patterns 3 hours before sunset. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the space of 5 minutes, creating a localized microclimate that left neighbors checking their thermostats with bewildered expressions. Most unnervingly, every electronic device within a 3-block radius began displaying the same time, regardless of their actual settings. Exactly 11 minutes past 7. Harry felt Dumbledore's presence before he saw him, a pressure in the air that made his scar tingle with uncomfortable warmth. It was as if reality itself was bending around someone whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions of suburban Surrey. The sensation reminded Harry uncomfortably of the way Uncle Vernon's presence had always made him feel small and powerless, except magnified beyond anything his 11-year-old experience had prepared him for. When Dumbledore finally appeared at the front door of No. 4 Privet Drive, he did so without the courtesy of knocking or announcing his presence. One moment the doorway was empty, the next it framed a figure who seemed to occupy more space than physics should have allowed. Tall and thin with silver hair that cascaded past his shoulders, Dumbledore wore robes that shimmered between deep blue and midnight purple, depending on the angle of observation. But it was his eyes that made Harry's breath catch in his throat, blue eyes that seemed to contain depths that went far beyond normal human experience, eyes that looked at Harry with an intensity that felt invasive, as if Dumbledore were reading not just his thoughts, but cataloguing every experience that had shaped his young life. The effect was immediately disorienting and profoundly uncomfortable. Harry felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability and everything to do with the sensation that someone was examining his soul without permission. It took every ounce of self-control he possessed to maintain eye contact, rather than looking away like the intimidated child Dumbledore clearly expected to find. "Good evening, Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying the kind of warm, grandfatherly tone that should have been reassuring but somehow felt manipulative. "I believe we have a great deal to discuss about your future and the rather concerning choices you seem to be contemplating." The phrasing was carefully calculated to establish authority, while suggesting that Harry's decisions were symptoms of confusion rather than legitimate expressions of personal agency. Harry recognized the technique from 11 years of adult conversations, designed to make him doubt his own perceptions and defer to supposedly superior judgment. "Good evening, Professor Dumbledore," Harry replied, keeping his voice respectful but firm. "I agree that we need to discuss my future, though I suspect we may have different perspectives on what choices serve my best interests." Dumbledore's eyebrows rose slightly, and Harry caught a glimpse of surprise that was quickly masked by renewed grandfatherly warmth. The headmaster had clearly expected to find a grateful, malleable child eager for rescue from his unfortunate circumstances. Instead, he was encountering someone prepared to defend his position through reasoned discussion rather than emotional manipulation. Uncle Vernon appeared in the hallway behind Harry, his face carrying the carefully neutral expression of someone trying to avoid giving offense to dangerous people. Aunt Petunia remained in the kitchen, but Harry could sense her attention focused on the conversation, despite her physical absence. "Perhaps we might sit down and discuss this matter properly," Dumbledore suggested, gesturing toward the living room with the kind of casual authority that assumed compliance would be automatic. Harry led the way into the living room, noting how Dumbledore's presence seemed to change the very quality of light in the space. Colors appeared more vivid, shadows took on depth and substance that ordinary shadows lacked, and the air itself felt charged with potential energy that made Harry's skin prickle with awareness. Dumbledore settled into Uncle Vernon's favorite armchair with the unconscious grace of someone accustomed to commanding any space he occupied. His blue eyes continued their unsettling examination of Harry, who chose to remain standing rather than accepting a position that would require looking up at the headmaster. "Harry, my dear boy," Dumbledore began, his tone radiating the kind of patient wisdom that adults often employed when explaining obvious truths to confused children. "I understand that your childhood has been challenging, and I deeply regret any hardships you may have experienced. However, I believe Professor McGonagall may have conveyed some misunderstandings about the arrangements made for your care." The word misunderstandings hung in the air like a challenge, and Harry felt his temper flare at the casual dismissal of 11 years of systematic emotional abuse, but he had learned enough about manipulation to recognize when someone was trying to provoke an emotional response that would undermine his credibility. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said carefully, measuring each word for maximum impact. "I don't believe there were any misunderstandings about my childhood. Uncle Vernon has documentation of every instruction he received regarding my care, including specific guidance about maintaining humility and gratitude through controlled deprivation of affection and basic necessities." Dumbledore's expression shifted subtly, and Harry saw calculation there. Not surprise, but the focused attention of someone recalibrating his approach based on new information about his audience's sophistication. "I see that you have been thinking quite seriously about these matters," Dumbledore acknowledged, his tone carrying a note of approval that felt patronizing rather than genuine. That level of analysis speaks well of your intellectual development, though I wonder if perhaps your conclusions have been influenced by understandable anger about circumstances that were necessary for your protection. Protection, the word that had been used to justify every cruelty, every deprivation, every systematic attack on Harry's developing sense of self-worth. Harry felt something cold and hard crystallize in his chest as he realized that Dumbledore was going to continue defending the indefensible rather than acknowledging institutional failure. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said, his voice gaining strength with each word, "could you please explain exactly what I was being protected from that required 11 years of emotional abuse and deliberate isolation from my own heritage?" The question was direct and uncompromising, designed to force Dumbledore to provide specific justifications for his decisions, rather than hiding behind vague appeals to necessity and superior knowledge. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying Harry with renewed intensity. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, less grandfatherly warmth, and more the tone of someone delivering unfortunate but necessary truths. "Harry," he said carefully, "there are forces in the magical world that would use you for their own purposes if they believed you could be influenced or controlled. Your fame, your history, your very survival of the killing curse that took your parents' lives makes you a symbol of hope for some and a target for others." The explanation felt incomplete, carefully edited to provide information without context. Harry pressed for specifics, refusing to accept generalities as adequate justification for systematic mistreatment. "What specific forces, Professor Dumbledore? What evidence suggested that normal childhood affection and security would make me more vulnerable to these unspecified threats? How exactly did sleeping in a cupboard and being told I was unwanted contribute to my protection?" Each question was designed to expose the logical inconsistencies in Dumbledore's protective framework, to demonstrate that the headmaster's decisions had been based on control rather than genuine concern for Harry's well-being. Dumbledore's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something underneath that looked less like benevolent wisdom and more like calculating coldness. It was the expression of someone who made difficult decisions based on strategic considerations rather than individual welfare, someone for whom the greater good justified any amount of collateral damage. "Harry, my boy," Dumbledore said, his voice taking on a tone of gentle firmness that felt more threatening than reassuring, "the magical world is not a place where normal assumptions about childhood and protection apply. Your enemies would not hesitate to use love, security, and happiness as weapons against you. By ensuring that you understood struggle and adversity, we prepared you to resist manipulation through false promises of ease and comfort." The logic was breathtaking in its cynical sophistication. Dumbledore had orchestrated Harry's misery, not despite caring about his welfare, but as a deliberate strategy to make him resistant to enemy manipulation. The systematic abuse had been presented as a form of emotional vaccination, designed to build immunity to future exploitation. But Harry could see the fundamental flaw in Dumbledore's reasoning, the assumption that made the entire framework collapse under scrutiny. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the older wizard's eyes narrow with attention, "your logic assumes that I will be grateful for rescue from artificially created suffering rather than resentful about the deliberate creation of that suffering in the first place." The observation hung between them like a sword, cutting through 11 years of carefully constructed justifications to expose the essential miscalculation at the heart of Dumbledore's strategy. "You assumed that controlling my childhood would make me controllable as an adult," Harry continued, his voice gaining confidence as he articulated insights that had been building throughout the day's revelations. "You assumed that manufactured desperation would make me grateful for whatever alternatives you offered. You assumed that isolating me from my heritage would make me dependent on your guidance for understanding my place in the magical world." Dumbledore's face had gone very still, the grandfatherly warmth replaced by something much more dangerous. His blue eyes held an intensity that made Harry's scar throb with uncomfortable heat, and the air around them seemed to thicken with barely contained power. "Those assumptions were incorrect," Harry said, meeting Dumbledore's stare without flinching, despite every instinct screaming at him to submit to the overwhelming magical presence filling the room. "I am not grateful for rescue from suffering you orchestrated. I am not desperate enough to accept any alternative without examining my options, and I am not willing to remain ignorant about my heritage simply because knowledge might make me less compliant with your plans." The silence that followed was so complete that Harry could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Dumbledore sat motionless in Uncle Vernon's armchair, but something in his stillness suggested coiled energy waiting for release. The temperature in the room had dropped several degrees, and Harry realized that he was seeing Dumbledore's true nature for the first time. Not the kindly grandfather figure who dispensed wisdom and comfort to confused children, but someone whose power was so vast and casually wielded that he had convinced himself that other people's lives were chess pieces to be moved according to his strategic vision. "Harry," Dumbledore said finally, his voice carrying undertones that made Harry's bones ache with sympathetic vibration, "I fear you may be making decisions based on incomplete information and understandable but ultimately misguided anger." The magical pressure in the room increased, and Harry felt something trying to push against his thoughts, seeking entry to his mind through pathways he didn't know existed. The sensation was violating and terrifying, the mental equivalent of someone forcing open a locked door to his most private thoughts and memories. But 11 years of surviving the Dursleys had taught Harry to protect his inner self from adult intrusion, and he instinctively pushed back against the foreign presence with every ounce of will he possessed. The effort left him dizzy and nauseous, but the invasive sensation retreated, leaving behind only the echo of Dumbledore's surprise. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said, his voice shaking slightly from the effort of magical resistance, but still carrying unmistakable steel. "Did you just try to read my mind without permission?" The question carried implications that went far beyond simple invasion of privacy. If Dumbledore was willing to use magical coercion during what was supposed to be a reasonable discussion about Harry's future, what other forms of magical manipulation had shaped Harry's life without his knowledge or consent? Dumbledore's expression cycled through several emotions before settling on something approaching regret, though whether for the attempt itself or for being caught remained unclear. "Harry, my dear boy," he said carefully, "sometimes it becomes necessary to understand the full scope of someone's thoughts and feelings in order to provide appropriate guidance. I was simply trying to assess whether your current perspective might be influenced by external factors that could be addressed through proper explanation and reassurance." The euphemistic language was designed to make magical mind-reading sound like therapeutic intervention rather than violation of basic mental autonomy. Harry felt his anger crystallize into something approaching rage, not the hot, uncontrolled fury that had marked his childhood magical accidents, but something cold and implacable and utterly focused. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said, his voice deadly quiet, "you have spent 11 years controlling my physical environment, my social relationships, my access to information about my own history, and my understanding of my options for the future. Now you want to control my thoughts and feelings as well." Each accusation hit Dumbledore like a physical blow, and Harry could see the headmaster struggling to maintain his facade of benevolent concern in the face of systematic exposure of his methods. "The pattern is clear," Harry continued relentlessly. "You believe that my role is to be grateful for whatever you choose to provide, and compliant with whatever plans you make on my behalf. You believe that my thoughts, feelings, and preferences are irrelevant except insofar as they help or hinder your strategic objectives." Dumbledore opened his mouth to respond, but Harry wasn't finished. "What you have failed to understand, Professor, is that your strategy has produced exactly the opposite of what you intended. I am not grateful for your management of my life. I am not compliant with plans made without my input. And I am not willing to continue accepting your authority over decisions that affect my future. The declaration was a formal rejection of everything Dumbledore represented, and both of them understood its implications. Harry was not simply refusing to attend Hogwarts. He was refusing to accept Dumbledore's right to make decisions about his life, to control his circumstances, to determine his destiny according to some larger vision that treated Harry as a component rather than a person. Dumbledore stood slowly from the armchair, his full height and magical presence filling the room with an almost physical weight. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the grandfatherly warmth that had characterized his earlier words. "Harry," he said, his tone now carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience, "I fear you are making a very serious mistake. The protection provided by these arrangements extends far beyond simple physical safety. There are magical bonds at work that cannot be casually discarded without consequences you are too young to understand. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Dumbledore was suggesting that Harry's rebellion would trigger magical consequences that could endanger not just Harry himself, but potentially others connected to the protective arrangements. But Harry had spent the afternoon researching international magical law, and he understood enough about magical contracts and binding agreements to recognize a bluff when he heard one. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said calmly, "if there are magical bonds that affect my well-being, then I have the right to understand their nature and terms before agreeing to continue honoring them. If there are consequences for choosing my own educational path, then I need specific information about those consequences rather than vague warnings about dangers I'm supposedly too young to comprehend." The response demonstrated that Harry understood the difference between legitimate magical constraints and psychological manipulation designed to maintain compliance through fear and uncertainty. Dumbledore's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or possibly respect, and Harry realized that he had just passed some kind of test he hadn't known he was taking. The headmaster was reassessing his approach based on evidence that Harry possessed more sophistication and resistance to manipulation than anyone had anticipated. "Very well, Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice taking on a different quality, more formal and less paternal. "If you are determined to make adult decisions about your future, then perhaps it is time you understood the full scope of what those decisions entail." The words should have been reassuring, an acknowledgement that Harry deserved honest information about his circumstances. Instead, they felt like a warning that the conversation was about to move into territory where childish innocence would no longer provide any protection. Harry straightened his shoulders and met Dumbledore's penetrating stare directly, drawing on every ounce of courage and determination his 11 years had built through necessity and survival. "I'm ready to understand, Professor Dumbledore," he said clearly. "But I want you to know that understanding the scope of my situation will not automatically make me grateful for your management of it or compliant with future arrangements made without my consent." The gauntlet was thrown, and both of them understood that the conversation had moved far beyond simple educational choice into questions about power, agency, and the fundamental right of individuals to control their own destinies. Dumbledore smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that the game was going to be far more interesting than he had anticipated. The portkey that would change Harry Potter's life forever arrived disguised as a crumpled sweet wrapper, blowing down Privet Drive in the pre-dawn darkness. Harry almost missed it entirely, focused as he was on the delicate process of climbing out his bedroom window without triggering the surveillance network that had monitored his every movement for 11 years. The wrapper caught against his trainer just as he lowered himself from the windowsill, and the moment his fingers closed around it, Harry felt the familiar tug of magic that had marked the most significant moments of his short life. But this magic felt different somehow, warmer, less invasive. Where Dumbledore's presence had pressed against his mind like a violation, This magic invited rather than demanded, offering assistance rather than imposing control. The portkey activated with a sensation like being pulled through warm honey, rather than the violent displacement Harry had expected from his research into magical transportation. Colours swirled around him in patterns that reminded him of sunrise over mountains, and for a brief, disorienting moment, he felt suspended between worlds, between the carefully controlled existence he was leaving behind and whatever possibilities awaited him in France. When the world solidified around him again, Harry found himself standing in what could only be described as a fairy tale made manifest in stone and crystal. Beauxbatons' Academy of Magic rose before him like a palace designed by someone who understood that education should inspire rather than intimidate, that learning flourished best in environments that celebrated beauty rather than demanding conformity. The main building soared toward the sky in graceful arcs that seemed to defy conventional architecture, its pale blue stone walls catching and reflecting the early morning light in ways that made the entire structure appear to glow from within. Gardens surrounded the academy in carefully planned chaos, where roses climbed walls in precisely arranged abandon, and fountains sang with crystalline voices that carried musical harmonies across the mountain air. But it was the sense of welcome that struck Harry most powerfully. Where Hogwarts had been described in terms that emphasized its ancient power and institutional gravitas, Beauxbatons felt alive with possibility and genuine warmth. Students moved across the grounds with easy confidence, their conversations carrying laughter that echoed off the mountain peaks without seeming to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. Harry stood at the edge of the arrival courtyard, suddenly acutely aware that his hastily packed bag and rumpled clothes marked him as someone fleeing rather than someone arriving by invitation. The elegant students around him wore robes that managed to be both practical and beautiful, their movements suggesting years of instruction in grace and deportment that extended far beyond simple academic preparation. Monsieur Potter, I presume. The voice that addressed him carried a French accent that made even his name sound more sophisticated than it had ever seemed before. Harry turned to find himself facing a woman whose presence commanded attention without demanding submission, whose authority felt earned rather than inherited. Madame Maxime stood nearly 8 feet tall, her impressive height somehow managing to suggest strength and protection rather than intimidation. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style that framed features carved with the kind of classical beauty that belonged in Renaissance paintings, and her robes flowed around her like liquid midnight, starred with silver embroidery. But it was her eyes that made Harry's breath catch with unexpected relief. Dark brown eyes that looked at him with genuine warmth and interest, eyes that saw a person rather than a symbol, a student rather than a strategic asset. For the first time in his 11 years, Harry felt truly seen by an adult whose primary concern appeared to be his well-being rather than his usefulness. Madame Maxime, Harry replied, attempting the formal bow his research had suggested was appropriate for French magical society. Thank you for allowing me to visit your academy. I know my application was somewhat irregular. Madame Maxime's laughter was like music played on crystal bells, warm and genuine, and completely free of the careful calculation that had marked every adult interaction of Harry's previous experience. Irregular, she agreed, her English carrying the kind of precision that suggested perfect fluency, despite the charming accent. But then, the most interesting students often arrive through irregular circumstances. Come, we have much to discuss, and I believe you would benefit from seeing what proper magical education might offer. As they walked through the academy grounds, Harry felt layers of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying begin to dissolve from his shoulders. The conversations around them flowed between French, English, and several other languages he couldn't identify, but the tone was consistently warm and engaged. Students greeted Madame Maxime with obvious affection and respect, but without the fearful deference Harry had observed in descriptions of student-teacher relationships at Hogwarts. The difference was immediately apparent and profoundly meaningful. These students saw their teachers as mentors and guides rather than authority figures to be placated or avoided. The atmosphere suggested collaboration rather than dominance, mutual respect rather than institutional hierarchy. Madame Maxime led him through corridors that seemed designed to celebrate learning rather than simply contain it. The walls displayed student artwork that demonstrated genuine skill and creativity, academic achievements that reflected individual excellence rather than standardized compliance, and historical exhibits that honored diverse magical traditions rather than privileging any single cultural approach. But it was the library that made Harry's heart race with possibility. 3 stories of books, scrolls, and magical documents, arranged not by arbitrary institutional categories, but by subject matter and accessibility. Students of all ages worked together at tables designed to accommodate different learning styles, and the atmosphere buzzed with intellectual excitement rather than enforced quiet. "This is beautiful," Harry breathed, unable to contain his amazement at the scope and organization of knowledge made freely available to students. "Knowledge belongs to those who seek it," Madame Maxime replied simply. "Our role as educators is to provide access and guidance, not to control who may learn what or when they may be ready for advanced understanding." The philosophy was so fundamentally different from everything Harry had experienced or read about British magical education that it took him a moment to process the implications. Students were trusted to pursue their interests. Learning was collaborative rather than competitive. Education was about developing individual potential rather than producing standardized outcomes. As they continued their tour, Harry met students from across Europe and beyond. A girl from Spain who specialized in magical botany and spoke 4 languages fluently. A boy from Norway whose family had sent him to Beauxbatons specifically because of their progressive approach to defensive magic instruction. Twin sisters from Italy who were collaborating on research into magical art restoration with one of the Academy's professors. Each student he met reinforced Harry's growing understanding that Beauxbatons operated according to principles that prioritized individual development within a supportive community framework. Competition existed, but it was competition to excel rather than to dominate. Achievement was celebrated, but not at the expense of those who learned differently or pursued different interests. The contrast with his limited understanding of Hogwarts was striking. Where British magical education seemed designed to sort students into predetermined categories and maintain those distinctions throughout their academic careers, Beauxbatons encouraged fluid movement between different areas of interest and expertise. During their tour, Harry was introduced to Fleur Delacour, a third-year student whose silver blonde hair and perfect features suggested some degree of non-human heritage. But it was her intellectual intensity, rather than her physical beauty, that immediately captured Harry's attention. She spoke with passionate enthusiasm about her advanced studies in international magical law and cross-cultural spell theory, subjects that apparently didn't exist in the Hogwarts curriculum. "You are the boy who rejected Hogwarts," Fleur observed, her English carrying only the faintest trace of French accent. "That requires considerable courage, or perhaps considerable foolishness. Which do you believe it was?" The question was direct, but not hostile, challenging, but not aggressive. Harry found himself appreciating the straightforward approach after years of adult conversations loaded with hidden meanings and ulterior motives. "I hope it was courage," Harry replied honestly. "But I suppose that will depend on whether the alternatives I'm pursuing actually serve my interests better than accepting what was offered." Fleur smiled, and Harry realized he was experiencing something entirely new in his limited social experience. A conversation with someone his own age who treated his thoughts and opinions as worthy of serious consideration rather than symptoms of confusion that needed correction. "Come," Fleur said, gesturing toward a group of students engaged in animated discussion near one of the library's tall windows. "You should meet some of the other international students. Your situation is unusual, but you are not the first to discover that educational choice requires active investigation rather than passive acceptance. The group Fleur led him toward included students from Germany, Portugal, Bulgaria, and several other countries Harry couldn't immediately identify from their accents. But what struck him most powerfully was the quality of their interactions. These were young people who had made conscious choices about their education, who understood that learning was a privilege to be pursued rather than an obligation to be endured. Their conversation ranged across topics that would never have been discussed at his primary school in Little Whinging. International magical politics, cross-cultural approaches to spell development, ethical considerations in magical research, career opportunities that existed outside traditional institutional pathways. Harry listened with growing excitement as he realized he was encountering peers who shared his curiosity about the broader world, who asked questions rather than simply accepting predetermined answers, who saw education as exploration rather than indoctrination. But it was the conversation about British magical politics that provided the most illuminating perspective on his own situation. The international students spoke knowledgeably about Dumbledore's reputation beyond Britain, his tendency to become personally involved in political situations, his belief that his judgment should supersede normal institutional processes. In France, one student observed, we have protections against educators who believe students exist to serve institutional purposes rather than institutions existing to serve student development. Your Professor Dumbledore would not be permitted to place children according to his strategic preferences rather than their family wishes. The casual observation hit Harry like revelation. What Dumbledore had done to him wasn't just morally questionable. In other magical societies, it would have been legally prohibited. The systematic manipulation of his childhood circumstances would have violated fundamental principles of educational ethics and child welfare. The knowledge was simultaneously liberating and infuriating. Liberating because it confirmed that his instincts about Dumbledore's behavior were correct according to international standards. Infuriating because it meant he had suffered unnecessarily, according to principles that were already well established elsewhere in the magical world. Fleur seemed to recognize the emotional impact of this realization, because she guided the conversation toward more practical concerns about Harry's potential admission to Beauxbatons. The application process, she explained, would involve formal interviews with faculty members who specialized in different areas of magical education, practical demonstrations of his magical ability and learning capacity, and essays that revealed his genuine interests rather than his ability to provide expected answers. But most importantly, the process would be collaborative rather than evaluative. The Academy's goal was to determine whether they could provide the kind of education Harry actually wanted, rather than whether he met predetermined criteria for acceptance. The approach was so fundamentally different from everything Harry had experienced with institutional authority that it took him several attempts to formulate the right questions. He was accustomed to being judged according to standards he had no voice in establishing, to having his worth determined by other people's assessment of his compliance and usefulness. The possibility that an institution might adapt its offerings to serve his genuine interests rather than expecting him to adapt himself to serve institutional purposes was almost too revolutionary to contemplate. Madame Maxime rejoined them as the afternoon light began shifting toward evening, her presence bringing focus to what had become an increasingly wide-ranging exploration of educational philosophy and practical considerations. Monsieur Potter, she said formally, I believe you have seen enough to understand what Beauxbatons offers. The question now is whether what we offer aligns with what you seek for your magical education and personal development. Harry considered the question seriously, weighing his morning observations against his research and his growing understanding of his own educational needs and interests. Madame Maxime, he said carefully, everything I have seen today suggests that Beauxbatons operates according to principles that prioritize student development and individual choice. That represents exactly what I hoped to find when I began researching alternatives to the educational path that was planned for me without my input. He paused, gathering his thoughts, before continuing with the directness he had learned from Fleur and her international colleagues. But I need you to understand that choosing Beauxbatons isn't just an educational decision for me. It's a declaration of independence from people who believe they have the right to control my life according to their strategic preferences, rather than my personal interests and development. Madame Maxime nodded gravely, and Harry saw recognition in her dark eyes. She understood that his application represented more than simple school choice. It was a fundamental rejection of the British magical establishment's approach to childhood and education. Monsieur Potter, she replied with formal dignity, Beauxbatons has always maintained that students must be free to choose their own educational path without coercion or manipulation from adults who claim to know what is best for young people. If you choose to apply for admission to our academy, we will protect your right to make that choice regardless of external pressure from British magical authorities. The words were carefully chosen and clearly understood by both parties. Beauxbatons was offering not just education, but sanctuary from the systematic control that had shaped Harry's childhood, according to Dumbledore's strategic vision. "Thank you, Madame Maxime," Harry said, feeling something shift decisively in his chest. "I would like to formally apply for admission to Beauxbatons Academy of Magic." The declaration felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Behind him lay 11 years of carefully managed existence designed to produce gratitude and compliance. Ahead lay the terrifying and exhilarating possibility of choosing his own path forward according to his own values and interests. "Excellent," Madame Maxime replied, her smile carrying genuine warmth and what might have been pride. "Your formal application process will begin tomorrow morning. Tonight you will stay in our guest quarters and have opportunity to observe evening activities and speak further with current students about their experiences." As the sun set behind the Pyrenees peaks, painting the academy walls in shades of gold and rose, Harry felt something he had never experienced before in his 11 years of life. Not just safety, though he was certainly safer here than he had been at Privet Drive. Not just acceptance, though these people clearly valued his presence. What Harry felt was possibility. The genuine, unlimited possibility of becoming whoever he was meant to be, rather than whoever other people needed him to become. For the first time since receiving his Hogwarts letter, Harry Potter was truly looking forward to his magical education. The British Ministry delegation arrived at Beauxbatons Academy 3 days after Harry's formal application process began, their appearance marking the end of the peaceful interlude that had allowed him to experience what magical education could be when freed from institutional manipulation and political maneuvering. Harry first became aware of their presence through the subtle changes in atmosphere that seemed to precede any significant magical confrontation. The morning air carried an edge of tension that made the Academy's usual harmonious energy feel strained and artificial. Students moved with less casual confidence, their conversations dropping to whispers when they encountered faculty members whose expressions had shifted from warm accessibility to careful neutrality. But it was the behavior of the Academy's protective wards that provided the clearest indication that something unprecedented was occurring. Beauxbatons had been constructed with magical defenses designed to create sanctuary rather than fortress, protection that welcomed legitimate visitors while discouraging those who approached with hostile intentions. The wards hummed with gentle energy that normally felt like a musical accompaniment to daily academy life, now that music carried discordant notes that made Harry's scar throb with uncomfortable warmth. The protective magic surrounding the academy was responding to the presence of visitors whose intentions toward the students and faculty were less than entirely benevolent. Harry observed the British delegation's arrival from the library's tall windows, positioned where he could watch the formal proceedings while remaining inconspicuous among the international students who had become his informal support network during his brief but intensive introduction to Beauxbatons culture. The delegation consisted of 5 individuals whose very presence seemed designed to project authority and institutional power rather than diplomatic courtesy. Their leader was a man whose expensive robes and carefully groomed appearance suggested high-ranking ministry position, possibly someone from the Department of International Magical Cooperation or the minister's office itself. Behind him walked 2 individuals whose bearing and alert postures marked them as auras, despite their attempt to blend into what was supposedly a diplomatic mission. Their eyes constantly scanned the academy grounds with the systematic thoroughness of people trained to identify threats and neutralize them before they could develop into larger problems. But it was the presence of the 4th visitor that made Harry's breath catch in his throat. Cornelius Fudge himself had apparently deemed Harry's situation significant enough to merit personal intervention, his green bowler hat and pinstriped robes making him instantly recognizable from the photographs Harry had studied during his research into British magical politics. The 5th member of the delegation remained partially concealed by a travelling cloak that obscured their features, but something about their size and movement suggested this was someone Harry should recognize, someone whose identity was being deliberately hidden until the appropriate dramatic moment for revelation. Madame Maxime met the British delegation in the Academy's formal reception courtyard, her impressive height and regal bearing making even Minister Fudge appear diminished by comparison. Her greeting carried all the diplomatic courtesy required by international magical law, but Harry could see the tension in her posture that suggested she was prepared for confrontation rather than genuine negotiation. The conversation was too distant for Harry to hear specific words, but the body language was eloquent enough to convey the essential dynamics. The British delegation had arrived with predetermined demands rather than requests, their positions supported by implied threats rather than legal authority. Madame Maxime's responses grew increasingly formal and distant as the discussion progressed, her diplomatic composure masking what Harry suspected was growing anger at the presumption that British magical authorities could simply demand compliance from an independent international institution. Fleur appeared at Harry's elbow with the silent grace that had marked all his interactions with Beauxbatons students, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something approaching grim determination. "They are demanding your immediate return to British custody," she said quietly, her accent more pronounced than usual in the way that suggested emotional stress. "They claim that your presence here violates international agreements about the education of magically significant British children." The phrasing was carefully euphemistic, but Harry understood the implications immediately. The British ministry was asserting some kind of special claim over his education and placement based on his fame and symbolic importance rather than normal legal principles governing student choice and parental rights. "What kind of international agreements?" Harry asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that were negotiated in private by people who never bothered to consult the children whose lives would be affected by them," Fleur replied with bitter precision. "The kind that treats students like political assets rather than human beings with rights and preferences." Other international students had gathered around them, drawn by the obvious tension and their growing concern about the implications of British magical intervention at their academy. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to outrage as the scope of the situation became clear. Harry felt a strange calm settle over him as he watched the diplomatic confrontation unfolding in the courtyard below. This was the moment he had known would come eventually, the point where his choice to pursue educational alternatives would be tested against the full institutional power of the British magical establishment. But he was no longer the isolated, manipulated child who had received his first Hogwarts letter only days earlier. He was surrounded by peers who understood the principle of educational choice, protected by an institution that valued student agency over political convenience, and supported by international magical law that recognized individual rights even when they conflicted with national interests. The confrontation escalated when additional figures appeared in the courtyard through what appeared to be authorized apparition directly onto Academy grounds. Harry recognized Kingsley Shacklebolt and 2 other Aurors, whose presence transformed the diplomatic mission into something approaching a military operation. But it was the appearance of Rubeus Hagrid that made Harry's heart sink with understanding of how thoroughly Dumbledore was prepared to manipulate his emotional responses to achieve compliance. The gamekeeper's massive frame and familiar face represented every positive association Harry had formed with the magical world, every moment of wonder and acceptance he had experienced during his brief introduction to his magical heritage. Hagrid's presence was calculated to trigger exactly the kind of nostalgic longing and emotional vulnerability that would make Harry question his decision to pursue alternatives to the predetermined path Dumbledore had established for him. It was manipulation disguised as friendly intervention, psychological warfare dressed up as concern for his well-being. Harry felt anger rise in his throat, not the hot, uncontrolled fury that had marked his childhood magical accidents, but something cold and analytical that allowed him to see Dumbledore's strategy with perfect clarity. Every element of this confrontation had been carefully orchestrated to pressure him into compliance through escalating displays of authority, emotional manipulation, and implied threats to the people who had offered him genuine alternatives. The international students around him seemed to sense the emotional significance of Hagrid's appearance, because their protective circle tightened almost imperceptibly. Fleur's hand found his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity that reminded Harry he was no longer facing institutional pressure alone. "They think we will be intimidated by their display of force," observed Klaus, a serious-minded boy from Austria, whose family had sent him to Beauxbatons specifically to avoid the nationalistic indoctrination that characterized magical education in his home country. "They assume that international students have no understanding of political manipulation and will defer to British magical authority out of ignorance or fear." The assessment was accurate and insulting in equal measure. The British delegation was treating Beauxbatons like a provincial institution populated by naive children who could be easily impressed by displays of ministerial authority and symbolic emotional appeals. But these international students had chosen Beauxbatons precisely because they understood the difference between education and indoctrination, between institutional support and institutional control. They recognized political manipulation when they encountered it, regardless of how it was packaged or justified. Professor Laurent approached their group with the measured steps of someone carrying significant news, his usually pleasant expression replaced by the kind of diplomatic neutrality that suggested serious political developments. "Monsieur Potter," he said formally, "Madame Maxime requests your presence in the formal conference chamber. The British delegation has made specific demands regarding your educational placement that require direct response from you personally." The phrasing was carefully neutral, but Harry understood the subtext. The British authorities were not content to negotiate with Beauxbatons administration about his admission status. They wanted to confront him directly, to apply whatever pressure they believed would be most effective in securing his compliance with their predetermined plans. Harry stood slowly, drawing strength from the supportive presence of his new peers and the knowledge that he was no longer facing institutional manipulation without allies or legal protection. The scared, isolated child who had lived in the cupboard under the stairs would have been terrified by the prospect of confronting ministerial authority and emotional manipulation simultaneously. But the young man who had spent 3 days experiencing genuine educational choice and respectful treatment was prepared to defend his decisions against any level of external pressure. "Thank you, Professor Laurent," Harry said clearly. "Please inform Madame Maxime that I will be happy to discuss my educational choices with the British delegation, provided that the conversation occurs according to international protocols for student rights and institutional autonomy." The specification was important, establishing that Harry understood his legal protections and expected them to be honored regardless of whatever special arrangements the British ministry believed justified their intervention. Fleur and several other international students accompanied Harry toward the conference chamber, their presence serving as both moral support and practical reminder that his situation was being observed by witnesses who understood international magical law and student rights. The formal conference chamber at Beauxbatons was designed to facilitate diplomatic discussion rather than intimidate participants, its tall windows and elegant furnishings creating an atmosphere of civilized discourse rather than institutional authority. But the presence of Minister Fudge and his delegation had transformed the gracious space into something approaching a tribunal. Harry entered the chamber with his head held high and his expression carefully composed, drawing on every lesson in dignity and self-possession that his brief time at Beauxbatons had provided. He was no longer responding as a child seeking adult approval, but as someone prepared to defend legitimate choices against institutional pressure. Minister Fudge rose from his chair with the practiced gestures of someone accustomed to commanding attention through position rather than merit, his green bowler hat and pinstriped robes somehow managing to look both official and slightly ridiculous in the elegant French setting. "Mr. Potter," Fudge began, his tone carrying the kind of condescending warmth that adults often employed when addressing children they expected to manipulate through false kindness. "I trust you understand why we have come such a long way to discuss your recent decisions about your magical education." The phrasing was designed to suggest that Harry's choices were symptoms of confusion rather than legitimate expressions of personal agency, that the adults in the room were gathered to provide guidance rather than demand compliance. But Harry had learned to read the subtext of adult communication during 11 years of survival at Privet Drive, and he understood exactly what kind of discussion Fudge had in mind. "Minister Fudge," Harry replied with careful politeness, "I understand that you disagree with my educational choices. What I don't understand is why my personal preferences about my own education require intervention from the highest levels of British magical government." The response was respectful but uncompromising, acknowledging Fudge's position while challenging the premise that ministerial authority should supersede individual choice in matters of personal education. Fudge's expression shifted subtly, and Harry caught a glimpse of something that might have been surprise. Clearly the minister had expected to find a confused, grateful child eager for rescue from foreign influence, not someone prepared to defend his position through reasoned argument. "Mr. Potter," Fudge continued, his tone becoming more formal and less condescending, "your education is not simply a personal matter. Your survival of the killing curse, your symbolic importance to the magical community, your potential future role in maintaining stability and security, all create obligations that extend beyond individual preference." The explanation revealed the fundamental assumption underlying the British position. Harry was not seen as a person with rights and agency, but as a national resource whose development should be managed according to governmental strategic interests rather than personal choice. "Minister Fudge," Harry said, his voice gaining confidence as he articulated thoughts that had been building throughout his confrontation with institutional authority, "are you suggesting that my fame gives the British government the right to control my education regardless of my own preferences and interests?" The question was direct and uncompromising, designed to force Fudge to acknowledge the authoritarian implications of his position rather than hiding behind euphemistic language about obligations and responsibilities. The silence that followed was broken by the soft sound of Hagrid shifting uncomfortably in his chair, his massive frame creating creaks that echoed through the conference chamber like punctuation marks of disapproval. "Harry," Hagrid said finally, his voice carrying the warm familiarity that had marked their brief interactions during Harry's introduction to the magical world, "you don't understand what you're giving up. Hogwarts isn't just any school. It's where you belong, where your parents went, where you'll find your place in our world." The emotional appeal was skillfully delivered, designed to trigger nostalgia for connections Harry had never actually experienced, and belonging he had never been permitted to develop naturally. Hagrid's genuine affection made the manipulation more effective than ministerial authority could ever be. But Harry had learned to recognize emotional manipulation even when it was delivered with sincere intentions, and he understood that Hagrid's concern was being weaponized by people who cared less about Harry's well-being than about maintaining control over his symbolic importance. "Hagrid," Harry said gently, recognizing that the gamekeeper was probably following instructions rather than pursuing his own agenda. "I appreciate your concern about my future. But belonging isn't something that can be assigned or inherited. It has to be chosen and developed through genuine acceptance rather than institutional placement." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing with the directness he had learned from his international peers at Beauxbatons. "What I've found here is an educational environment that treats me as a person rather than a symbol, that encourages my questions rather than demanding my compliance, that offers choices rather than predetermined destiny. That feels more like belonging than anything I experienced in 11 years under British magical authority." The words hit the assembled delegation like physical blows, and Harry could see them struggling to maintain their diplomatic composure in the face of accusations they couldn't easily refute or dismiss. Minister Fudge's face had reddened considerably, and his voice carried an edge of frustration that suggested his patience with diplomatic courtesy was reaching its limits. "Mr. Potter," he said, his tone now openly authoritarian rather than persuasively warm, "I'm afraid your romanticized view of international education may be preventing you from understanding the serious security implications of your current situation." The shift to open threats was significant, indicating that the British delegation had abandoned attempts at persuasion in favor of more direct forms of pressure. Harry felt something cold and hard crystallize in his chest as he realized that the conversation had moved beyond educational choice into territory where his fundamental rights as an individual were being subordinated to governmental convenience and political strategy. The revolution that had begun with his rejection of the Hogwarts letter was about to escalate into open conflict with the full institutional power of the British magical establishment. The attack on Beauxbatons Academy came at 3 minutes past midnight on a moonless night when the mountain air was still and the protective wards hummed their usual gentle songs of welcome and sanctuary. Harry woke not to the sound of magical combat, but to the sudden, absolute silence that fell when the Academy's defensive magic was overwhelmed by forces that should not have been able to breach international magical law with such casual efficiency. The silence was wrong in a way that made Harry's scar burn with recognition before his conscious mind could process what was happening. Every magical building he had encountered possessed its own subtle energy signature, a background hum of enchantments and protective spells that created an atmosphere as distinctive as a fingerprint. The complete absence of that familiar magical presence meant that something fundamental had been severed or suppressed. Harry rolled from his bed in the guest quarters and moved toward the window with the instinctive caution that 11 years of survival had built into his reflexes. What he saw in the Academy courtyard below made his blood run cold with understanding of just how far his pursuers were prepared to escalate their efforts to reclaim control over his future. Figures in dark robes moved across the Academy grounds with military precision, their movements coordinated in ways that suggested extensive planning and reconnaissance. These were not random attackers or opportunistic criminals. This was an organized assault by people who understood Beauxbatons' defensive systems well enough to neutralize them systematically and efficiently. But it was the magical signatures surrounding the attackers that made Harry's breath catch in his throat with recognition and growing rage. The spells being used carried the distinctive energy patterns of British magical instruction, the specific techniques and theoretical frameworks that marked graduates of Hogwarts and ministry training programs. The attack was not being carried out by unknown magical forces, despite whatever official denials would inevitably follow. This was British magical operatives conducting an illegal assault on an international educational institution, violating every treaty and protocol that governed magical diplomacy between sovereign nations. Harry's dormitory door exploded inward with a blast of crimson light that left smoking gouges in the stone walls, and filled the air with the acrid smell of magical combat. Through the debris stepped a figure whose presence made Harry's scar throb with painful intensity. Someone whose magical signature was so familiar and threatening that Harry's accidental magic responded before his conscious mind could process the identity of his attacker. The burst of protective energy that erupted from Harry was unlike anything he had ever experienced during his childhood magical incidents. Where those had been chaotic and uncontrolled, this was focused and purposeful, driven by conscious intent rather than unconscious emotion. The golden light that surrounded him carried warmth instead of destructive force, creating a barrier that pushed back against the dark magic attempting to overwhelm him. The figure in the doorway stepped backward with what might have been surprise, lowering a wand that had been pointed directly at Harry's chest with obvious intent to incapacitate rather than injure. But Harry could see calculation in the hooded features, assessment of his capabilities, and potential responses. "You have grown stronger than expected," a voice said from beneath the concealing hood, the words carrying a note of professional interest that was somehow more chilling than outright hostility. "Professor Dumbledore anticipated that your time among foreign influences might accelerate your magical development, but this level of conscious control suggests more significant advancement than his models predicted." The clinical tone made Harry realize that his magical display was being evaluated as data, rather than treated as a defensive response from someone whose life was being threatened. He was not seen as a person protecting himself, but as a test subject, demonstrating capabilities that needed to be measured and catalogued. "Who are you?" Harry demanded, his voice steady despite the fear and rage coursing through his system. "What gives you the right to attack innocent students and faculty?" The figure's laughter carried no humor, only the kind of cold amusement that suggested Harry's questions revealed naivety about the realities of magical politics and institutional power. "Rights are defined by those with sufficient strength to enforce them," the voice replied with casual brutality. "Professor Dumbledore has determined that your continued residence at this institution poses unacceptable risks to British magical security. We are here to correct that situation, according to his explicit instructions." The confirmation that Dumbledore had ordered this assault hit Harry like a physical blow. Not random criminals or rogue operatives, but people following direct orders from the man who claimed to represent the highest values of magical education and child protection. Harry felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the magical world and his place within it. This was not a conflict between competing educational philosophies or differing approaches to childhood development. This was authoritarian power asserting itself through violence when diplomatic pressure and emotional manipulation failed to produce desired compliance. The realization crystallized into rage that transcended anything Harry had ever experienced. Not the hot, uncontrolled fury of his childhood, but something cold and implacable and utterly focused on protecting the people who had offered him genuine choice and respect. His accidental magic responded to that focused intent with power that surprised everyone in the room, including Harry himself. The golden barrier around him expanded outward with enough force to blast his attacker through the destroyed doorway and into the corridor beyond, where the sound of impact suggested collision with stone walls that were considerably more solid than human bone. Harry stepped through the debris of his door and found himself facing a corridor filled with smoke and the aftermath of magical combat. The sounds of fighting echoed from throughout the academy as students and faculty defended their sanctuary against attackers whose presence violated every principle of international magical law. But it was the sight of Fleur Delacour pressed against the corridor wall, with her wand trained on two unconscious figures in dark robes, that made Harry understand the full scope of what was occurring. These attackers were not just targeting him specifically. They were willing to threaten anyone who had supported his choice to pursue alternatives to British magical authority. "Harry," Fleur called when she saw him emerge from the wreckage of his quarters, her voice carrying relief mixed with grim determination. "Are you injured?" "The attackers seem to know exactly where to find you," which suggests either internal intelligence or external surveillance we failed to detect. The implication was clear and disturbing. Either someone within Beauxbatons had provided information about Harry's location and routines, or the Academy's supposedly secure communications and protective systems had been compromised by people with access to sophisticated intelligence-gathering capabilities. "I'm not injured," Harry replied, moving toward Fleur while maintaining awareness of the unconscious attackers and the possibility of additional threats emerging from the ongoing combat throughout the Academy. "But these people are here on Dumbledore's direct orders. This isn't random criminal activity. This is an authorized assault by British magical operatives." Fleur's expression shifted from grim determination to something approaching fury as the implications of Harry's statement became clear. Her voice, when she responded, carried an edge that reminded Harry that she came from a magical culture that took international law and institutional sovereignty seriously. "If British operatives are conducting unauthorized military operations on French soil," she said with deadly precision, "then this constitutes an act of magical warfare that will trigger immediate diplomatic response from the French ministry and probably the International Confederation of Wizards." The political ramifications were staggering, and Harry suspected that Dumbledore had either failed to consider them or had decided that retrieving control over Harry's symbolic importance justified risking international magical conflict. The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention toward the main staircase, where Madame Maxime appeared with her wand drawn and her expression carrying the kind of controlled fury that suggested someone was going to answer for the violation of her Academy's sanctuary. Behind her came Professor Laurent and several other faculty members whose magical signatures indicated they had been engaged in serious combat, but had emerged victorious. Their robes bore scorch marks and tears that testified to the intensity of the fighting, but their determined expressions suggested that Beauxbatons' defenses had ultimately proven effective against the assault. "Monsieur Potter," Madame Maxime said, her voice carrying relief mixed with rage at the circumstances that had made such relief necessary, "are you harmed?" "We have repelled the attackers, but several were captured alive, and their identities may provide important information about who authorized this violation of international magical law." Harry straightened his shoulders and met Madame Maxime's eyes directly, drawing on the confidence his brief time at Beauxbatons had helped him develop. "I am unharmed, Madame Maxime," he replied formally, "but I believe you should know that the attack was carried out on Professor Dumbledore's explicit orders. The attackers made that clear during their attempt to capture me." The silence that followed Harry's statement was so complete that he could hear the distant sounds of magical cleanup and security protocols being implemented throughout the Academy grounds. Madame Maxime's expression cycled through several emotions before settling on something that looked like iron determination. "If that is accurate," she said slowly, her accent becoming more pronounced in the way that suggested emotional stress, "then Professor Dumbledore has committed an act of war against a sovereign magical institution. The French ministry will demand explanations and reparations through official channels, and I suspect other international magical governments will take a very dim view of British willingness to use military force to resolve educational disputes." Professor Laurent stepped forward with the kind of formal precision that suggested he was shifting into his role as Beauxbatons' liaison to international magical law enforcement. "Madame Maxime," he said carefully, "I have already initiated emergency communications with the French Aura Corps and the International Magical Cooperation Department. Given the nature of this assault and its apparent authorization by high-ranking British magical officials, I believe we must also notify the International Confederation of Wizards about potential violations of the Educational Sovereignty Treaty." The administrative language carried implications that made Harry realize his personal educational choice had triggered a diplomatic crisis that could reshape relationships between magical governments across Europe and beyond. But underneath his concern about international political ramifications, Harry felt something else crystallizing into resolution. Dumbledore's willingness to authorize military assault against an educational institution revealed the true nature of his character more clearly than any amount of philosophical debate or diplomatic pressure could have achieved. This was not someone who made difficult decisions based on careful consideration of competing values and interests. This was someone who believed that his strategic objectives justified any level of violence against people who interfered with his plans. "Madame Maxime," Harry said, his voice carrying a weight that surprised everyone present, "I want to provide formal testimony about this attack to whatever international authorities investigate Professor Dumbledore's actions. I want it clearly established that I chose to attend Beauxbatons freely, and that I was threatened with violence for exercising that choice." The request was significant because it represented Harry's transition from protected student to active participant in the legal and political consequences of Dumbledore's actions. He was no longer simply seeking educational alternatives. He was challenging the fundamental assumption that his symbolic importance gave British magical authorities the right to control his life through any means they deemed necessary. "Monsieur Potter," Madame Maxime replied with formal dignity, "Beauxbatons Academy will provide every possible support for your testimony, and will ensure that international investigators understand the full scope of what occurred here tonight." She paused, studying Harry's face with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was reassessing her understanding of his character and capabilities. However, she continued, "I must warn you that challenging Professor Dumbledore through official channels will likely trigger additional pressure and possibly more direct attempts at coercion. The magical world has been conditioned to regard his judgment as unquestionable, and your testimony will force many people to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional authority and individual rights." Harry considered the warning seriously, understanding that his formal testimony would transform him from a student seeking educational choice into someone directly challenging the most powerful wizard in Britain through legal and political channels that Dumbledore could not easily control or manipulate. "Madame Maxime," he said quietly, drawing strength from the supportive presence of Fleur and the other students who had gathered to ensure his safety, "I spent 11 years accepting other people's definition of what was best for me. I spent those years being grateful for scraps and compliant with decisions made without my input." He straightened his shoulders and met her eyes with steady determination. "I am done being a passive participant in my own life. If providing testimony against Professor Dumbledore creates political complications or personal danger, then those are consequences I am prepared to accept in order to establish that children have rights that cannot be violated simply because adults claim to know what is best for them." The declaration was a formal rejection of everything the British magical establishment had tried to impose on him, and everyone present understood its significance. Harry Potter was no longer the grateful, malleable tool that Dumbledore's strategy had been designed to create. He was someone prepared to use every legal and political resource available to defend his right to choose his own path forward, regardless of whatever consequences that choice might create for the people who had assumed they could control his destiny without his consent. The revolution that had begun with his rejection of the Hogwarts letter had evolved into open warfare, and Harry Potter was no longer content to be a prize fought over by competing authorities. He intended to be the person who decided his own future, whatever the cost of that independence might prove to be. As dawn broke over the Pyrenees peaks, painting the damaged academy buildings in shades of gold and rose, Harry felt something settle into place in his chest. Not just determination, though he was certainly determined to defend his choices against any level of external pressure. What Harry felt was the quiet confidence that came from understanding his own power and his willingness to use it in defense of principles that mattered more than personal safety or institutional approval. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was prepared to fight back against people who believed they had the right to control him, and the weapons at his disposal were not just magical ability, but the law, international politics, and his own unshakable refusal to surrender his agency to anyone who claimed authority over his life without his consent. The investigation that would expose 11 years of systematic manipulation and control began 3 days after the attack on Beauxbatons Academy, when French Aura investigators arrived at No. 4 Privet Drive with authorization to search for evidence of the surveillance network that had monitored Harry Potter's childhood on behalf of British magical authorities. What they discovered in the seemingly ordinary suburban house exceeded even their most pessimistic expectations about the scope and sophistication of the operation that had been conducted against a magical child without oversight or legal authorization from any legitimate governmental body. The hidden surveillance equipment was woven into the very structure of the house with such subtlety that only the most advanced detection spells could identify its presence. Magical monitoring devices had been embedded in the walls during construction, creating a comprehensive network that could track everything from Harry's emotional state to his accidental magic incidents with precision that would have impressed professional intelligence operatives. But it was the discovery of Dumbledore's sealed records, hidden behind protective charms in the cupboard under the stairs where Harry had spent most of his childhood, that provided the investigators with documentation of a conspiracy that violated every principle of magical child welfare and international educational law. The records were meticulous in their detail and chilling in their casual treatment of Harry's systematic abuse as necessary components of a larger strategic plan. Every aspect of his placement with the Dursleys had been carefully calculated to produce specific psychological and emotional outcomes that would make him more susceptible to guidance and control when he eventually entered the magical world. Senior Investigator Delacour, Fleur's aunt, and one of France's most respected experts in magical child welfare law, read portions of the records aloud to the assembled international team with a voice that grew increasingly strained as the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation became clear. Subject placement with hostile relatives confirmed effective for maintaining emotional isolation and preventing development of excessive self-confidence. She quoted from documents bearing Dumbledore's personal seal and signature. Regular deprivation of affection and basic necessities producing desired gratitude response when minimal positive reinforcement provided by approved contacts. The clinical language describing Harry's systematic emotional abuse made several investigators visibly uncomfortable, but Senior Investigator Delacour continued reading with professional determination. Subject demonstrates appropriate compliance when threatened with withdrawal of basic necessities or social contact, the records continued. Placement Guardian reports successful implementation of controlled deprivation protocols designed to prevent subject from developing unrealistic expectations about personal agency or institutional treatment. Each revelation hit the assembled team like a physical blow, but it was the discovery of Harry's parents' actual will that provided the most damaging evidence of Dumbledore's willingness to violate legal and moral boundaries in pursuit of his strategic objectives. The document, hidden beneath layers of concealment charms that had required specialist curse breakers to penetrate, revealed that James and Lily Potter had explicitly designated Sirius Black as Harry's guardian in the event of their deaths. They had also specified that under no circumstances should Harry be placed with Lily's sister Petunia, whose hostility toward magic they understood would create an unsuitable environment for a magical child. More significantly, the will included detailed instructions about Harry's education and upbringing that emphasized the importance of allowing him to make his own choices about his magical development rather than imposing predetermined expectations or obligations based on his survival of Voldemort's killing curse. The contrast between James and Lily Potter's actual wishes for their son's future and the circumstances Dumbledore had created for him was so stark that even experienced investigators struggled to maintain professional objectivity while reviewing the evidence. Senior Investigator Delacour set down the will with careful precision, her expression suggesting someone grappling with evidence of institutional corruption that exceeded her previous experience with magical child welfare violations. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said formally, addressing the international team that had gathered to evaluate the scope of violations against Harry Potter's rights and welfare, "what we have uncovered represents the most systematic violation of magical child protection laws in the recorded history of international magical cooperation. She gestured toward the boxes of evidence that had been removed from Privet Drive during 3 days of intensive investigation. Professor Dumbledore not only violated this child's parents' explicit wishes regarding his guardianship and upbringing, but he created and maintained conditions of systematic emotional abuse designed to produce psychological compliance with his strategic objectives. The formal language carried implications that extended far beyond Harry's individual situation, raising questions about how many other magical children might have been subjected to similar manipulation by authorities who believed their institutional wisdom superseded parental rights and individual agency. But it was the testimony of other former students who had come forward in response to international publicity about the investigation that provided the most comprehensive picture of Dumbledore's systematic approach to controlling magically significant children. Neville Longbottom, now 16 and studying advanced magical theory at an international academy in Switzerland, provided detailed documentation of how his magical development had been systematically suppressed during his years at Hogwarts through teaching methods designed to undermine confidence rather than build competence. Luna Lovegood, who had transferred to a progressive magical school in Scandinavia, described institutional bullying that had been permitted and even encouraged as a means of maintaining social isolation that made students more dependent on faculty approval and guidance. Most damning of all was the testimony of Tom Marvolo Riddle, now calling himself Lord Voldemort, whose transformation from promising student to dark wizard had apparently been facilitated by Dumbledore's manipulative approach to magical education and student development. The connection between Dumbledore's controlling methods and the creation of the very enemy he claimed to be protecting magical society created a narrative so disturbing that several international investigators required time to process its implications before they could continue their work. Senior Investigator Delacour compiled the evidence into a comprehensive report that would reshape international understanding of magical child welfare and educational ethics for generations to come. But it was her personal interview with Harry Potter, conducted in the safety of Beauxbatons Academy under international legal protection, that provided the most powerful testimony about the human cost of institutional manipulation disguised as child protection. Harry sat across from the senior investigator in Madame Maxime's private office, surrounded by the elegant furnishings and warm atmosphere that had come to represent everything his childhood had lacked. But despite the comfortable setting, discussing 11 years of systematic abuse remained emotionally difficult and psychologically exhausting. "Mr. Potter," Senior Investigator Delacour said gently, her voice carrying the kind of professional compassion that suggested extensive experience with traumatized children. "I understand that reviewing these experiences is painful. However, your testimony is crucial for establishing the full scope of violations that occurred and ensuring that similar situations are prevented in the future." Harry nodded, drawing strength from the knowledge that his suffering might serve to protect other children from experiencing similar manipulation and control. "Senior Investigator Delacour," he said quietly, "I want other magical children to understand that adults who claim to know what's best for you while refusing to explain their reasoning or consider your preferences are not acting in your best interests, regardless of their reputation or institutional authority." The statement was carefully crafted to address the fundamental power dynamic that had enabled Dumbledore's manipulation to continue unchallenged for so many years. Harry understood that challenging individual violations was less important than exposing the systemic assumptions that made such violations possible. "Can you describe, for the record, how Professor Dumbledore's control over your childhood circumstances affected your understanding of your own rights and options?" Senior Investigator Delacour asked, her quill poised to capture testimony that would become part of international magical law regarding child welfare and educational choice. Harry considered the question carefully, understanding that his response would influence how future cases of institutional manipulation were evaluated and addressed by international authorities. Professor Dumbledore's strategy was designed to make me grateful for any alternative to the suffering he had orchestrated, he said slowly, choosing his words for maximum legal and political impact. By controlling every aspect of my childhood environment, he ensured that I would have no basis for comparison when evaluating whatever options he eventually offered. The psychological sophistication of Dumbledore's approach was becoming clear through Harry's testimony, revealing someone who understood manipulation techniques with professional precision rather than stumbling into harmful practices through good intentions and poor judgment. The systematic isolation prevented me from learning about my magical heritage, my parents' actual wishes for my future, or the existence of educational alternatives that might better serve my interests and development, Harry continued. When Professor Dumbledore finally revealed the magical world to me, I was supposed to be so desperate for acceptance and belonging that I would accept whatever role he had predetermined for me without question. Senior Investigator Delacour's expression grew increasingly grim as the full scope of Dumbledore's psychological manipulation became clear through Harry's careful analysis of his own experience. "Mr. Potter," she said formally, "are you stating for the record that Professor Dumbledore deliberately created conditions of deprivation and abuse in order to make you more susceptible to his influence and control when you entered magical education?" The question was legally significant because it established intent rather than mere negligence, transforming Dumbledore's actions from policy mistakes to criminal violations of international magical law regarding child welfare and educational coercion. "Yes," Harry replied without hesitation, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that came from understanding his own experience clearly. "Professor Dumbledore created my circumstances deliberately and maintained them systematically in order to produce specific psychological outcomes that would serve his strategic objectives rather than my personal development or well-being." The formal testimony was devastating in its clarity and implications, providing legal foundation for charges that could reshape how international magical law addressed institutional authority and individual rights in educational settings. But it was Harry's description of the night Dumbledore had attempted magical manipulation of his thoughts and emotions that provided the most shocking evidence of how far the respected headmaster was prepared to go in maintaining control over his strategic assets. "Professor Dumbledore attempted to read my mind without permission during our conversation about my educational choices," Harry testified, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of describing such a fundamental violation of mental privacy. When I resisted his intrusion, he became angry rather than apologetic, suggesting that he considered access to my thoughts and feelings to be his right rather than something requiring my consent. The casual treatment of mental violation as an acceptable tool for managing student behavior revealed aspects of Dumbledore's character that contradicted every public statement he had made about respecting individual dignity and student autonomy. Senior Investigator Delacour completed Harry's formal testimony with documentation that would serve as the foundation for international magical law reform and criminal charges against one of the most powerful wizards in modern history. But as the investigation concluded and the evidence was compiled for presentation to the International Confederation of Wizards, Harry felt something more significant than legal vindication settling into place in his understanding of his own identity and future. For the first time in his 11 years of life, adults with genuine authority and legal power had listened to his experience, believed his testimony, and taken action to address the violations he had endured. Not because his symbolic importance made him politically valuable, but because his rights as an individual had been systematically violated by people who should have protected them. The investigation had revealed that his instincts about Dumbledore's manipulation had been accurate according to international standards of child welfare and educational ethics. His decision to pursue alternatives to the predetermined path had been legally and morally justified by evidence that no reasonable person could dispute or dismiss. Most importantly, the formal legal recognition of his right to choose his own educational path established precedent that would protect other magical children from experiencing similar manipulation and control by authorities who claimed to act in their best interests while refusing to respect their preferences or agency. As Senior Investigator Delacour prepared to leave Beauxbatons Academy with evidence that would trigger the largest magical law enforcement investigation in modern history, she paused to address Harry directly about the implications of his decision to pursue formal legal action against Dumbledore. "Mr. Potter," she said seriously, "your testimony and the evidence we have gathered will almost certainly result in criminal charges against Professor Dumbledore that carry significant penalties under international magical law. Are you prepared for the political and personal consequences of challenging someone with his reputation and influence?" Harry considered the question carefully, understanding that his legal victory would trigger backlash from people whose worldview depended on believing that institutional authority was inherently benevolent and that individual resistance to that authority was symptoms of ingratitude or manipulation by foreign influences. "Senior Investigator Delacour," he replied with quiet determination, "I am prepared to accept whatever consequences result from defending my right to choose my own educational path and challenging systematic violations of child welfare law." He paused, drawing strength from the supportive presence of Fleur and the other international students who had become his chosen family during his brief but transformative time at Beauxbatons Academy. "But I am no longer prepared to accept other people's definition of what is best for me or to remain grateful for treatment that violates my basic rights as an individual, regardless of whatever institutional authority supports that treatment." The declaration was a formal rejection of everything the British magical establishment represented, and Senior Investigator Delacour understood its significance as both legal testimony and personal manifesto. "Thank you, Mr. Potter," she said with formal dignity. "Your courage in pursuing this investigation will benefit magical children throughout the international community for generations to come." As the French investigative team departed with evidence that would reshape international magical law and bring criminal charges against the most powerful wizard in Britain, Harry felt something settle into place in his chest that had nothing to do with legal vindication or political victory. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter knew with absolute certainty that his own judgment about his rights and interests was not only valid, but legally protected by international authorities who understood the difference between genuine child protection and institutional manipulation disguised as benevolent guidance. The scared, manipulated child who had lived in the cupboard under the stairs had become someone capable of challenging the most powerful magical authorities in the world and winning through careful legal action and unwavering commitment to principles that mattered more than personal safety or social approval.